I am going to pass this over to Kaylee and Linda to get started.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the workshop. Today we're going to talk about the proposed plan for augmentation and acquisitions of contractual interests in water to augment stream flows on the Cache la Poudre River. We talked about this in detail at the November board meeting, and it's an action item on the board meeting agenda for Monday. For each item on today's agenda, we'll give a short presentation followed by discussion. So the allocated times are for both presentation and discussion. And today is an opportunity for you to ask many questions, and we'll do our best to answer them and to just have a good discussion about this proposal. And I'd like to introduce who will be presenting and available for questions today. Next slide, please. With CWCB staff, Kaylee White and Colin Watson are here. Jen Mealy from the AG's office to address legal issues. We have the names on the slide, the ones in bold are the presenters, and the ones not in bold are people who are available for questions. So for engineering aspects of the proposal, we have Greg Sullivan and Heidi Welsh from Spronk Water Engineering. Katie Birch from CPW is with us to explain and address biological flow needs on the Poudre. Kate Ryan and Allison Gould from Colorado Water Trust are here to address any questions about project management. And Dan Brown, who represents the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association, will talk to you about the partnership and about the memorandum of agreement that we've entered into. For the seed water rights donors, we have, for Fort Collins, we have Eric Potyandi and Susan Smolnick. City of Thornton, we have Emily Hunt, Carrie Bischoff, and David Tossig. And then from Greeley, Jennifer Petrozelka and Dan Bewer. We also have Kyle Whitaker and Nathan Baker here from Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. They are also participants in our stakeholder group. So this proposal is the result of several years of work by numerous stakeholders looking for ways to add water to the Cache la Poudre River with the goal of it being a healthy working river. The initial group was called the Poudre Runs Through It, and they formed a flows committee to dig into finding a way to increase flows at critical times and locations on the Poudre without injuring other water rights. CWCB staff and Colorado Parks and Wildlife participate in the flows committee, which includes the partners you're going to hear from today and others. The group has also continuously consulted with and included the Division of Water Resources in its discussion of this plan. So in 2018, it became apparent that legislation would be helpful in guiding the water court process for a plan for augmentation to augment stream flows. And in 2019, House Bill 19-1271 was introduced for that purpose, but it did not survive the legislative process. To address the many concerns that were expressed in 2019, the Poudre Flows Group participated in numerous stakeholder discussions on how to craft this type of bill. And in 2020, House Bill 2010-37 passed with widespread support. So all those meetings paid off in listening and incorporating a lot of the stakeholder concerns. So those discussions are reflected in the many safeguards for preventing injury to water rights that are included in the bill. With that, I will turn it over to Kaylee to walk you through the provisions of that legislation. Thank you.
Good morning, Kaylee White with CWCB staff in the Stream and Lake Protection section. We are actually going to go through these as somewhat as agenda items, so we'll pause in between so that we can have some discussion. So the item one is the legislation, kind of a summary. So I put some summaries and some quotes of kind of the key points of the legislation here. House Bill 20-1037 is codified in sections 3792-102, which is where most of the in-stream flow statute is. It's a new section, 4.5. And there was an adjustment to 3792-3058C regarding augmentation plans. So we'll go through the key provisions here. The first one is kind of a directive to CWCB about how to achieve one of these augmentation plans. So it says to obtain a decreed plan for augmentation, and this is for an augmentation to augment stream flows, the CWCB board must file an application with Water Court. They can do it solo, on their own, or with partners, and that's in statute. They must protect the augmentation deliveries that are made pursuant to the plan for augmentation within a specific stream reach or reaches, and at rates the board determines are appropriate to, my shortcut here, preserve and improve the natural environment to a reasonable degree, which is all spelled out in statute, subject to, and then they have principles and limitations that are in the statute. Some of those principles and limitations I've listed here. I've got 3 slides on this. So first, the augmentation water rates that are included in the plan must have already been judicially approved for a change of water rates, and that change must include augmentation use, and the historical consumptive use must have already been quantified. And if this change has already occurred, they're eligible for a augmentation plan to augment stream flows without a future change case, without an additional change case. So speaking of that previous change case, the third bullet here, the use of the augmentation water in the plan is subject to terms and conditions of applicable decrees to which the water is subject. So that previous change case, any other underlying decrees. So all of that's in statute, and we've got to honor that, of course. So then there's some additional terms and conditions provisions in statute. One is that additional terms and conditions must be imposed as necessary to prevent injury to other water rights, including, and this is a long quote from statute, I'm going to read through it. It's kind of packed, but I think it's important. So terms and conditions to prevent injury to other water rights that result from any change in the time, place, or amount of water available for others for diversion or exchange, to the extent that the other appropriators have relied upon stream conditions that resulted from the historical use of the augmentation water rights before their use in this plan. So we'll talk more about how we're handling that provision in this plan. So the second thing here is it also requires honoring some undecreed existing exchanges. And so the way that the statute reads is an applicant must prove that the plan for augmentation to augment stream flows will not injure other water users' undecreed existing exchanges to the extent that those undecreed existing exchanges of water were administratively approved before the date of filing the application, our application in Water Court for this plan. And third and final slide on this, that it also requires that, this is if we need to modify any existing structures to shepherd the water through the reach, that if the operation of the plan for augmentation requires use of or making physical modifications to someone else's existing diversion structure, Then the operator of this plan must have 1, consent from the owner of the structure, and 2, bear all reasonable costs for construction, for operation, and for maintenance. So that's also in statute. Now this last bullet is about augmentation plans in general, and the caps are what was just added. So instead of it being a new statute, the caps clause is what was added to the existing statute, that a plan for augmentation, including this type of plan, a CWCB plan to augment stream flows, may provide procedures to allow additional or alternate sources of augmentation or replacement water. So what this means is, we're going to start out with the seed water rates from these 3 municipalities, and there'll be a provision in the decree that allows us to add additional water to the aug plan at a later time. And those terms will be negotiated in the court. So that is pretty much the legislative summary. I think what we want to do here is pause and see what kind of questions have come up. Now I can't see the chat, so if anybody has a question, just.
Hello? Hello?
I can hear you, whoever
Can
that
anyone
is.
hear me? Okay,
Yes.
this is Jackie Brown. Oh no. I have a question, and it's a general question. Can you explain to me how this process is different than a donation of a water right into an in-stream flow?
Oh, yes, I'll
Like,
take that and rely on my partners to help with any further clarification. But one thing that
I guess before you start, to clarify, not I guess how it's different, but why the 2 different programs are needed.
Okay.
So why wouldn't one just use a donation to an in-stream flow instead of this augmentation program?
Right. So there's a couple things here. Let's see, one, there is no existing in-stream flow on this reach of the Poudre. So it kind of complicates it a little bit, but we could still take individual donations. So we could have done this, but individual donations, individual water court cases, individual change cases. And I think we probably would have had to have change cases to change the water rate to an in-stream flow use. And it would have been, 1 at a time. So what this does is it looks at the river as a whole, and this actually came from the community wanting to improve their river, and they had water rights and came to us. So it's much more efficient this way because we set up kind of a framework, and we already have the reach identified and the flow rate targets identified so that people can bring water rights into the program. So it's kind of a programmatic framework to bring in those individual donations or purchases or leases.
Sure, Kaylee, and thank you so much. I guess what I'm looking for is why don't we create the in-stream flow in order to do this? It's just a general question I have so that I can just check the box between why one would choose to operate under this program as opposed to the creation of an in-stream flow, and then why don't we need the in-stream flow first?
Haley, do you want me to take that one?
Sure, yeah.
So the reason that we are not asking the board to appropriate an underlying in-stream flow water right on this reach of the Poudre River is that there is not water available for such an appropriation. And this tool provides a way to bring water in from willing partners to augment the stream flows. So it's really not feasible, nor both technically and most likely politically to appropriate an underlying in-stream flow on this reach. So this gives us an alternate way to achieve in-stream flow protection.
Thanks, Linda. So if someone were to want to donate to an in-stream flow, wouldn't that resolve the unappropriated waters question if you were donating to the in-stream flow? I'm not arguing with the program. I'm just trying to put these in different boxes so I understand all the tools and why you choose to use one over the other.
Well, if someone wanted to donate water for in-stream flow protection, then as Kaylee had said, we would have to change that water rate. And the board would have to make findings on flow rates. And this tool provides another way of getting at that. It provides more flexibility. Water rights owners aren't crazy about changing their water right. They have to go to court, quantify it. It's risky for them. And so this is another tool that provides us some flexibility and a different way to accept a donated water right or a contractual interest in water and protect it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The next question is from Jim Yan, or Dave Tosick. Did you want to add something?
Sure. Yeah, Dave Tosick, I represent Thornton. I guess one of the other things, Commissioner Brown, is that under an augmentation plan under the statutes, you have the ability to add additional sources to an augmentation plan, to notice and that whole process. So that is one of the things that this plan is set up to do, is to get that underlying mechanism of a plan for augmentation along the Poudre River, and then allow future owners of water rights to bring those water rights in and put them into the program, including agricultural users that may want to get money to do that. So that's another reason, I guess, it's different than your individual donation program.
And
Thank you.
I'll
Yeah,
add
the
one.
flexibility seems to be the key with this.
One more thing is that usually when we have a donation, we change the water rate to the beneficial use of in-stream flow. And here the underlying beneficial use is augmentation. So it doesn't have to be individually changed in water court to an in-stream flow use because it already has an augmentation tag on it. And by statute, now we can use that in one of these programs subject to all of these limitations.
Eric, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm Eric Payandi. I'm with the city of Fort Collins. I agree with everything that's been said to explain. And one additional aspect that's arguably beneficial with the augmentation plan approach, as opposed to appropriating an underlying in-stream flow right and then adding water to that, is that by not having an underlying in-stream flow water right decreed to the reach, you are not affecting the potential for exchanges and future junior exchanges that may be developed in the future.
Director Yan, I think we're ready for your question.
All right, thanks. And actually that rolled right into my question with what Eric had to say there. I was just, in the statute, it talks about any current undecreed exchanges, but that's one standard in the statute that we have. But is there something in the agreement with the water users that they worked out that maybe is more stringent? And one of the things that popped into my mind is future exchanges on some water. So is that a protection as well? And how are we going to carry that out if there's things within the agreement that maybe are more stringent than the legislation?
Kaylee, can you take that one? I think, Director Yan, were you asking if the provisions of the MOA address future exchanges?
Yeah, or anything within the MOA that may be a little more, maybe a bigger hurdle than what just the legislation lays out to us. So it could be I was just thinking of future exchanges. We don't want to infringe on something that might happen in the future, within this in-stream flow, because we're just, if I'm understanding correctly, we're just adding some water to the stream, and that's the only in-stream flow that we're asking for is whatever's donated within these reaches.
Great. I think I might rely on Dan Brown a little bit here, but in the MOA, there's a management committee that's set up, and we'll go into that a little bit more. But the intent is to use in this plan new water to this reach of stream. So water that historically has been used, for irrigation, it hasn't been in the stream. So when we bring it back to the stream, it will be new in the sense that nobody could have used it before this plan because it wasn't there. It was running through a ditch and through a field, and then the return flows will be maintained. But Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, this sort of rolls into what I was going to talk about, but to respond to this question, the water users, it was a non-starter for water users to be on board with a new in-stream appropriation precisely for this reason. It would tie the river up. So not to mention that it wouldn't have been very effective. It's a very appropriated river, so an in-stream flow right wouldn't have amounted to much good. It was also objectionable for these reasons. But to Jim's question, indirectly, if this plan is operated the way that it's envisioned, the river should function as it always had. And this is sort of like a little bit of additional water that we're going to protect. So this is added water, as Kaylee's saying, new water that would not have been there. So the administration is going to be key, but this is going to be just a little water on top of what had already been there, and the river should function as it always had beyond this added water. So I hope that makes sense, Jim. But that's the concept, and getting the administration right is going to be the key. But if it works out right, that nobody should be impacted, because this is sort of a separate little, almost like you can envision a little bit of a pipeline within the river where this small amount of, or maybe large amount of flow is being separately handled.
That makes sense, Dan, and that's the way I envisioned it. But I just want to make sure that however we proceed, that we do that, and the administration of this, and maybe I'm getting too far into the weeds here, but the administration of this is key, because you're on a river, you're not in a pipeline. So, sometimes the river doesn't act like you would hope it would act. And so we just have to make sure that that we are not injuring someone because we think the water should be there and it really hasn't made it, or, how the South Platte and the Poudre works. It doesn't always act like you would hope it would act.
Yeah, and the water users, I think the whole group is keenly aware of this, and it's something I think we've anticipated in our agreement that I'll talk about and that we're working on. But I think the group understands that aspect, that this won't function with mathematical precision. Nevertheless, I think the group thinks is worth pursuing.
Okay, no, that's good. The reason that this is brought up to me is because it just happened yesterday on the right near Kersey, where we passed some water past Riverside Reservoir, and it's supposed to come to us. Usually it takes 4 hours. It finally got there at 6 o'clock last night for the Bijou Irrigation District. So it's one of those things where, depending on the conditions of the river, conditions of the year, it can vary. So that's the administration of this is probably pretty key, especially to your water users, I would think, Dan.
Absolutely. You're speaking to our, one of the things we're concerned about, of course. And I think we're all attuned to and trying to make sure it happens. But in some regard, I think we're going to have to actually operate this plan to some degree to understand how to administer it. But I think we set the stage for that.
Good.
Director Yuan, I'll just add that we didn't say, but there are several folks from Division of Water Resources here at the workshop today who can kind of help us kind of work through some of the questions and some of the plans to address some of these concerns. So Kevin Ryan, I think Tracy's here, Corey DeAngelis, and Mark Simpson, the water commissioner. All those folks are here to kind of help us out.
Right. No,
Right,
I
I neglected
saw all their
to
names
mention
there. That's good.
Director Trick has a question.
Yes, thank you. So going back to the legislation language, when you look at the sections that mandate the board to do certain things such as prove that the plan will not injure other water users, undecreed existing exchanges, for example, and also that we're mandated to have consent from owners of existing structures, et cetera, et cetera. What process or policy or procedures are in place for the CWCB right now to go through those mandated processes? Are there any? I mean, how are we doing that process to make sure that we're complying with the statute?
Right. Yeah, thanks for the question, Director Trick. I think most of that, what we plan to do is just more through the water court process than through the board process, that we and our partners will work with the folks in the community. People have concerns, people are in the case, through Division of Water Resources for administration to address those specific things. It'll be in the water court application, and then through that process. I don't know if there's any, I don't see any specific other process for the board necessarily. Linda, do you have anything to add to that, or?
I am sorry, I'm answering emails asking for the link to get into the meeting. I'm juggling a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up on that, unless Linda, you have a comment first.
I do not.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess, so can you be clear about whether or not our staff has done outreach to figure out, or what outreach has been done to figure out where and if there are undecreed existing exchanges of water on these reaches, and or whether consent from structure owners who identifying who they are, whether they would be present on those reaches, et cetera? Have we done that kind of outreach?
Thanks for the question. So I think the outreach that we've done is mostly with Division of Water Resources, who would have approved those undecreed existing exchanges, and from the water users who are our partners on the river, who know about those. I think we've had some meetings with some various stakeholder meetings, and we'll continue that process. And of course, in water court, you know, we've had people contacting us about concerns in general, and the whole group is completely open to talking to, of course, everybody who has a concern. The group's pretty big, so mostly, you know, the water users in the basin that know how that river operates, including Division of Water Resources. We're relying on them. And then for the structures, Northern is working a bit with some structure owners for the protected mitigation releases for the NEST project from Glade Reservoir, and they're also a partner here and a co-applicant in the water court case. So we'll be working with Northern on working through those. And I think I see a note that Kevin has, he's got some comments from DWR's perspective. Kevin Ryan.
Thanks, Kaylee. Just a quick comment to the extent it's helpful, Director Trick and maybe Director Yan on some of your comments. I just want to remind you that DWR has been involved. We're fortunate that the group involved us, probably, Linda, going back 5 or 6 years ago in this conversation, and we've been very much engaged in it and watching it closely. So I can say that with a court application like this, through our normal summary of consultation process, we'd be involved, and some of these things you're asking about, Director Trick, we would watch that closely through the division engineer's office, through Corey DeAngelis and his team, and Tracy Kozloff. So there is one party there that would be watching those closely, and of course, as Kaylee said, we'd have that good information on existing exchanges. Thank you.
Director Hawkins, you have a comment?
I do, and it's not really a question. In my day job, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to rewater heavily administered reaches of river. And certainly the southwest tributaries of the San Juan and the Dolores are not administered like the Poudre or the South Platte. But I just wanted to offer my perspective that I'm really excited to see, the enormous effort from the community moving forward here, because as we've discussed today, there are sort of pros and cons to some of the other tools that we have in the in-stream flow toolbox. And I think that it's really not a great fit in a reach of river like this that is really heavily administered. And so I just wanted to make a comment that from my perspective, it's really exciting to see the first big augmentation plan move forward, because we can understand how to keep that balance of protecting existing uses and making a sort of local and community-led plan for keeping flows in the river. And so I just wanted to make a comment as someone who works on issues and understands the limitations of some of the other tools. I'm really excited to see one that can work in a space where there's heavy administration and where some of our other in-stream flow tools are not as good. So that was my comment.
Thank you, Director Hawkins. Director Trick has a follow-up question, and then Director Brown, you'll be up.
Thanks. I was just going to follow up on one thing with Kaylee, when you mentioned there were, stakeholder group meetings and you received public comments from water users on the Front Range, or, that operate in this area. Has the board been provided with like a summary of what those concerns or comments were? I'm not sure that I saw that information in our packets. So have we been provided with any information on what concerns possibly were out there and expressed to staff?
Kaylee, do you want me to take?
Hey, either way.
Go ahead.
Okay, just briefly. So, we have the rulemaking hearing process going on at the same time. So for the rulemaking hearing process, when we get public comments, those are official for the hearing, and we're very careful about, providing all those details, and that's part of the hearing record. So this is a little bit different. A hearing wasn't requested here. So when we get comments from the public, and I don't know if it wouldn't necessarily come to staff for the board. This is just, the partners and other people working on the river, other water users, just commenting and kind of asking about the project in general. So there's no like official tracking of those. It's just people talking to each other. And I'm not sure how much we've done some stakeholder outreach, and in this process, I don't even remember what all we've, different people are going in different directions just to get the word out and talk to the community. So I think it's more like community discussions at this point, but I don't think anything is officially directed to the board. And Linda?
And I'll just add that during the legislative process, the stakeholder discussions I referred to were under the auspices of the Water Congress State Affairs Committee, and pertain to language that was going to be included in the bill. And so the bill reflects the concerns that the drafters and the stakeholders heard. With that, Director Jan has a comment, unless Director Trick, you have something else?
Well, I wasn't referring specifically to the bill language. I was referring specifically to comments that maybe have been submitted on this particular plan.
I don't think anything's directly been submitted to the board. We had our meeting in November, and members of the public are here today at this workshop. Nobody's officially asked to make public comment, but we can certainly have, if anybody at the public that's here wants to have some discussion, we have that, at the end of this meeting. But nothing officially there was no hearing requested and no official request to address the board.
And we have had some informal conversations with stakeholders, with others, to discuss their concerns. Next up would be Director Jan.
Actually, I think Director Brown was ahead of me.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is getting tricky.
No, sorry.
There's always one. So I think I'll reserve, I have some general questions about how this functions after a decree is given, if it is given. And I know we have Q&A at the end, but I didn't really see that it fit under the other agenda items. Is it your advice, Linda, that we wait? I know the other board members here have probably a lot of questions too. When this was at the end of our November meeting, I think we were all pretty tired, and so having some extra time to read through this and think about it gave us all, I'm sure, more questions. So what's your pleasure? Would you like to wait until the end? I don't want to hijack the agenda.
So Director Brown, your question is about how the decree would be administered?
Okay, well, let's just jump into it then. My question is, if there is a decree, if this goes forward and we do approve this application to Water Court, and it does receive a decree, who monitors these water rights, both the seed and then any additional water rights in the future, to make sure that, if there's a new water right filed or a change case, is that now going to be CWCB staff and the AG's office, or is it going to be the Colorado Water Trust, or somehow this committee that's being set up? Can you help me understand what happens post decree?
Kaylee, do you want to field that one?
Director Brown, I think I caught most of it. So post decree, there's a management committee to actually manage the project itself, and to manage, for instance, filing statements of opposition to protect the plan, that the committee, which is composed of all the partners here and the co-applicants, would decide like whether or not a statement of opposition is to be filed in a certain case or whatever, and to operate the daily operations, the delivery of the water, the shepherding the water, all the questions that come along. And also, so I think your question was also for adding other water rights to the plan. I wasn't sure if that was part of your question.
No, it was just future water rights that could be added. So I guess what I'm getting at is, like, if this all goes through, will the board expect to see these filed? Like, is this CWCB's water right at the end of the day that we are now in charge of protecting, sorry, not water right, but in our consent agenda, we see all the statements of opposition protecting the ISS. Is this going to be a 55-mile stretch that we are now monitoring every water right that is touched until the end of time? Or is that the job of the committee and it's not going to come before the board?
I see. So I think that the committee will do the first view. You know, if I would think it would be a rare case where we would actually file a statement of opposition, but it's possible that if the committee believe that a statement of opposition was important to file, then yes, it would have our name on it and it would come through in consent agenda. I think the water users are represented here with our partnership, and I know Dan Brown's the voice for the Cache la Poudre Water User Association. So I would think it would be rare if we did file a statement of opposition. It's not going to be like a normal in-stream flow because we're just adding water to the stream and then protecting that added water. So what, as Dan was saying, the operations of the river should just continue as they always have and shouldn't impact our water rate, and we shouldn't be impacting theirs if everything works properly. And
Kaylee,
then if we,
I think I might be useful for me to jump in here.
Oh,
This
yes,
is one of the things I was going to talk about. And in general, I think it's very important. This will be what I'm talking about here shortly, but to understand this plan, I think you need to understand and review, and I'll try to describe in summary what the MOA says, what we've all agreed to as a group about how this is going to proceed. And this is one of the issues. We've specifically dealt with the fact in our agreement that the management committee, which consists of all the partners here, will be the entity tasked with defending the plan in water court, filing statements of opposition. And none of us, except for protection of actual water rights donated to the plan, none of us will view it as our job to protect the plan. The management committee is collectively tasked with doing that. And frankly, that's something the water users wanted to see, because we didn't want to be blunt, invite the Colorado Water Conservation Board and other state entities to file opposition in everything that was going on in the basin. So that's one of the things that we tried to address in the agreement.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Director Jan, you're up.
Yeah, I just had a comment, and yeah, we probably should move on to the agenda because Dan's going to give his whole speech before we even get to it. So, but I'm kind of with Director Hawkins. You know, this is actually, I feel, from the water users. They even pushed the legislation. So this is a widespread involving lots of people over a long period of time. So that's what gives me some kind of, you know, contentment with this whole thing, is that a lot of these things have been vetted, which is different than some of our in-stream flows, which, you know, we throw out there, and sometimes people don't know exactly what's going on when it happens. And so this one is, in my mind, it's such a heavily used river, and it's such a well-known stretch of river that everybody pretty much knows what's going on in that stretch. And then the other thing is that it has to go to water court, and you have to live by all the water court standards, and everybody gets a chance to interject in there. And then what Dan just said about the management committee kind of controlling all this, it gives me, you know, a lot of faith that this will be run correctly. And so that's one of the things that's different maybe than a lot of our in-stream flows. And I just want people to know that that's kind of within all these water users, including Northern, who's here as well, that they're all coming together, looking at the stretch of river and trying to make it better and make it work for all the people. So so I think it's a good idea. We just need to do it correctly.
Thank you, Director Jan. Director Trick has a question.
Yeah, I just want to get some clarification on the term that were, that I've been hearing today, the water users. So I'd like to get clarification on who exactly we're referring to when we're saying the water users, because I know there's a group called the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association. And I wanted to know, when we're saying the water users, are we referring to that specific group, or are we referring to the global quote unquote water users in the South Platte Basin? So who are we referring to when we're saying the water users?
Well, I can try to take that as well if you'd like.
Please.
From my perspective, I think I'd mentioned last time that I represent the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association, which is a association comprised of members, and the members include all the major water users in the basin, and it's governed by a board of directors that consists of the major irrigation companies primarily. So I do think it's important, it's a good point, that when we're talking about the water users in that context, there is this is an organization that is comprised of that membership, but I tried to be clear at the last meeting that I don't speak for individual water users. There are ditch companies, and there's a whole host of water users that have their own boards of directors, and frankly may not be completely up to speed on what's going on. But through the Water Users Association that I represent, we've tried to keep as best we can water users in the basin apprised of what's going on. But back to a prior question, I think there's some additional outreach that's going to need to go on before we file the application, and certainly while the application's pending in court, to the actual water users themselves and their boards of directors.
Hey, Linda, could I pick up on one thing that Director Trick said that, that Director Yon said that may help this process? That I think it's important to remember that this legislation and all the requirements will be determined by the water court itself. That the CWCB board does not have to make determinations of injury, does not have to make determinations of which exchanges are out there. So this was so important because some of those processes go through an administrative thing. Early on, when we put the legislation together, we heard loud and clear, this has to go through water court. So that really is where all of the protective measures for the other water users that are not involved with the process will get protection. So it's really, that's where they get the protection, is in that water court process. Just wanted to clarify that's where it happens.
Thanks, Dave. Well, are we ready to move to the next agenda item? I don't see any other questions in the chat.
I think since we've been going now for a little over 45 minutes, maybe this is a good time for a break. And then we can come back and do that one. We weren't going to take a break until after the next couple, but I think after 45 minutes, everybody's okay with that. We'll just take a 5-minute break and then come back. Okay, hopefully most everyone's back. This is Kaylee speaking again, if you can't see me. So before we dive into the next item, and maybe this is what Director Trick was referring to, we did receive a letter from Brad Grasmick and Ryan, mostly, I guess it's just from Brad, on behalf of the Larimer and Weld Irrigation Company. So it was addressed to Linda and me, and we had conversations with Brad, and the rest of the group has had some conversations with them too. They are a member of the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association. And I think some of them are here today. We've got Ryan and I think Andy Pindea, I think, is also here. So we were going to address that in the public comment period at the end of the workshop. So we have that letter and we'll provide it to the board for Monday's meeting. Later today, we'll get it out to you. So with that, I'll go forward. Let's see, how do I do this? Share screen again to get back to the presentation. Okay, hopefully that worked. Okay, oh, here's where I turn it over to Dan Brown. This is just a slide, just took a couple of snips off of the MOA. This is phase 2 of it's a 3-phase project. Phase 1, CWCB was not a signator and involved only towards the end of phase 1. Phase 2 was just getting the project going, establishing the management committee. And then phase 3 is going to be implementation, which hasn't started yet. So we are a signator to this phase 2, which establishes management committee, among many other things. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Kaylee. I know the workshop is to answer questions, so I'll try to be brief, but in listening to these discussions so far, I think it might be helpful for me to go back and give a little bit of background about how we got where we are, in addition to discussing this MOA I've been talking about, which contains the terms and conditions that we as a group have agreed to in terms of how we're going to go forward. In that regard, I'd note that, at least speaking for the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association, this legislation is important and the protections in it, et cetera, but we're principally have been focused on and are focused on the terms and conditions in this MOA because they set forth what we believe to be the key things necessary for the Cache la Poudre water users support here. And in broad strokes, it's making sure that water rights and historical administration is not impacted by the operation of this plan, and that it remains a locally managed project to address a local problem. So with that, I'll go back a little bit just to get back to how we got here without going through all the gory detail. But this whole effort kicked off in 2012 with a stakeholder group called the Poudre River Runs Through It group that originated in 2012. And this was convened by the Water Institute at CSU. And the idea was to get what they were calling citizen experts together. There was about 25 or 30 of us with representing diverse interests on the river. And the idea was to see if we could communicate about ways we could improve the health of the river while respecting the working nature and the working heritage of the river and respecting water rights, et cetera. So one of the initial issues that arose right off the bat when we were having these preliminary discussions is what can we do about low flows in the river and dry up points in the river? And it was the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association position at that time that, hey, if we respect property rights, we respect prior appropriation administration, we can do this without impacting water rights, and in short, protect the status quo, and not do this in a way where we're trying to steal water from water users or upset administration. Our position was if we can go about it like that and solve this like a water problem, then this association wouldn't object, we'd even assist. So that's what's going on here, that's what's happened. We've tried to put together a plan that does all of these things. And so what happened then initially was, okay, we come to this sort of broad agreement, and the PRTI group put together an initiative to explore whether we could go forward. So at that time, it was our position and the position of several that a new appropriation for in-stream flow, as I discussed earlier, was a non-starter here. But our position was there are other tools in the toolbox where in the prior appropriation system, we can deal with in-stream flows. So this augmentation idea was actually a water user's idea. And the idea was to use the prior appropriation system and existing tools to address this problem. So that's how we got this idea started. We went on the road talking to some parties, the division. We're trying to see if there was a fatal flaw. And this is phase one. And so phase one consisted of Fort Collins, the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association, City of Greeley, and Northern. I think the Water Trust was assisting us at that point as well. So we got to the end of phase one and we said, this looks like it might work. Let's implement phase two. So phase two of this is we're trying to actually implement this program, and that's what we're up to right now. And so as part of phase two, one of the first things we did is we needed to approach the CWCB because the CWCB is obviously necessary to manage and hold in-stream flows. So we also approached Parks and Wildlife because they needed to assist with the stream reach and the various things that are necessary to make this plan move forward. At that point, Thornton had heard about what was going on and they wanted to participate. So that's our group, phase two. And it took us quite some time to then get on the same, I mean, not that we had major disagreements, but it was important for us to hash out at that stage with that big and diverse of a group of interests that we get on the same page about what we are trying to accomplish. So that is what I've been referring to as the phase two MOA or Memorandum of Understanding. That's our agreement about how we've decided to go forward with this. It's about a 30-page agreement. It sets forth goals, our goals and guiding principles, how and what sort of water we will accept, how the plan will be implemented, how it will be managed, how decisions will be made, what the day-to-day administration of this plan will look like, if and when we're successful, how we'll prosecute the process we're in right now in the water court process, and how funds will be allocated. So I think that agreement's probably in your packet. Won't go through it in great detail, but I think the main points are, at least from the water user standpoint, is this is a plan that was developed by local water users primarily and for the benefit of the Poudre Basin. And so that's our focus. I know others have an idea that this will be a tool to be used elsewhere, and that's great, but our focus has been on trying to solve a local problem. And then the other main point is that this plan is going to be operated in a way that won't injure water users or impact existing water rights and administration. So that's the goal. Getting a little more into the detail in terms of the goals, it's to increase the stream flow and to protect the water that's added and to not cause injury. But we've made clear in the MOA that beyond just mere protection of injury, we're going to consider and protect existing exchanges, existing practices on the river, and existing operation administration. This is important to the association because it's back to the whole point of we want to preserve the status quo, and to the extent we add on top of that, that's fine, but we don't want to have, as water users, to be impacted or injured or bear the brunt of some of the fluctuations on the river, for instance, that we talked about before. Important to that is understanding that we have made clear in the agreement that what is going to be protected is what we've called added water. Added water is defined as water that did not historically flow in the stream reach. So this is important because it needs to be new water to the reach, not recolored water that had been in the reach that now is being protected. And because the Cache la Poudre River is a heavily appropriated river, as has been mentioned, but it also is essential for many of the water users that there are many important and numerous significant exchanges that operate on the river. And to the extent we're recoloring water that's already in the river and taking away exchange potential, that we consider not protecting the status quo. So that's important. The other thing I mentioned is that this is, in our view, important that this remains controlled locally. Obviously, so the idea is that this management group will will be the one in charge of this plan, not any one of us individually. And the management plan envisions that all of the decisions will be made by this management committee consisting of one member of every one of the parties, and that we will operate by consensus. This too is important to the association as well as others, because it's how we envision that we will make sure this over time, this plan remains true to the guiding principles we've set out. Finally, I'd mention that the day-to-day operation of the plan, the agreement envisions that it will be the Cache Poudre Water Users Association that will be doing the communicating with the water commissioner and the ditch companies, et cetera, in terms of how this actually works day to day. So the association considers that important in the water users, so we can see what's going on and verify, again, that it's operating the way it's supposed to. I think the last thing I'll say is, although it's in the statute, the agreement does make clear that there won't be any modification in any existing structures without agreement and consent. So just to conclude, I think it's important for the CWCB and then all the parties on the call and otherwise to understand that we have an agreement that I think in some ways is perhaps more stringent than might be required by the statutes and by CWCB rules and regulations, and that's important to the water users, and I think all the members, that we understand that we're adhering to a agreement we've all entered into, and it's this agreement that's the basis for the water users' continued support. So guess I'll leave off there if there are questions.
Director Brown, looks like you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that. I guess my question, and you had started to answer it in the previous agenda item when I asked about protection, post-degree, or what the plan refers to as phase 3. And again, I mean, the other board members have said it, but this is an amazing collaborative process. I applaud all of you for the obvious hard work you've done over the years. And so please don't take my questions in any way to mean that, I don't like this plan or that I don't trust you, but just trying to do our job as board members. So in the MOU, it doesn't really clarify any phase 3 agreement. So it does talk about the partner's intent if it enters phase 3, but it's not clear to us what phase 3 looks like. And I just wonder if we should see the phase 3 draft agreement so that we understand how this is supposed to operate when you get there. What are your thoughts on that?
I think my take on that is I appreciate what you're saying. In helping to draft this phase 2 MOA, we were recognizing that it's impossible for us to fully anticipate, I think, what phase 3 will look like until we get through the water court process and we put all of this together. So that was the constraint we were dealing with. Is I don't know that we were in a position to develop a phase 3 agreement. And I don't think we still are in a position to develop a phase 3 agreement, but it was certainly important to me that we were clear that we were anticipating certain things that would happen in phase 3 so that there was not some misunderstanding. So that's what I was trying to accomplish. And I think others were trying to accomplish, is anticipate phase 3, for instance, in the idea that the administration of the plan would be through the Water Users Association. That was one of several things that I think we tried to anticipate. But I guess to answer your question, I think to develop a phase 3 MOA, we kind of need to get further along in this process.
Director Dutton, it looks like you have a question.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Dan. This question I think might be for you, Dan, or for anyone else, so feel free to punt it if you need to. Thanks for the explanation of the MOA, and in there's it's U, not A, sorry, different CWCB topic. In there, as you said, there's the discussion of costs and the note that the intent is to have the seed water be donated, but throughout the documents that are in our memo and packet, there's a reference to market-based. And so I'm just kind of trying to understand what market-based is referring to if there aren't going to be costs.
My take on that, others could chime in, but one of the things that I hadn't mentioned, but was a little bit of an incentive for water users to participate here, is we envision that as this plan is fully developed, there may be opportunities for spot use of water. It just might create some opportunities for water users to utilize their water in this plan if it made financial sense. So water users are looking at this, or at least I was on their behalf, as maybe a potential for them. But it was important, and elsewhere in the document, it was intended to be clear that this is voluntary. People's use of their water in this would be voluntary, and they would be compensated for it. And maybe it was unnecessary to go through that, but I think that was the idea, is this is going to be a voluntary program, and people might be compensated for their water.
And I think I can add to that, Director Dutton, is that for the seed water rights, no one has asked for any compensation for the municipal water rates. So we're not asking, you know, they haven't asked the board or any of the partners for compensation. But in the future, when we add water to the plan, it could be through leasing, it could be through any of our other acquisition tools, and compensation may be requested from the board or from the partners. So when we do bring these back, and we will bring these back to the board as they come in, so the board can accept these interests in water, there may be a request for compensation, which is, you know, totally reasonable in my mind.
Director Trick?
Going off of the discussion we're having about compensation or monetization of this, are there going to be ongoing administrative costs to operate this plan for the committee, and where are those going to be allocated from?
I think our fiscal agent is Kate Ryan. And Kate, would you like to take that question? I'm not seeing her name up.
Sure.
Oh, there she is.
I should be on now. Yep. Happy to take the question. Director Trick, when you talk about the committee and ongoing costs, I wasn't quite sure. By the committee, do you mean the MOA committee? Or?
I think the management committee was
sure. So right now we do have quite a few engineers and attorneys working on this project. We have done fundraising for the costs of that engineering support work and to cover the costs of the participation of the Water Trust as fiscal agent and project management. But we also have entities contributing their own time. So the project partners that we're working with, Cache la Poudre Water Users Association, Fort Collins, Northern, Thornton, and Greeley, they are participating in monthly meetings and have been helping in the past on things like supporting the legislative process. And they are participating on their own dime through their own representatives.
I have a follow-up to that if possible.
Please go ahead, Director Trick.
Thank you, Linda. So I guess for long-term operations, then what is the plan for funding the management committee if that body is to be a permanent body? Is it just going to be the
Sure.
donation of time of the members, or how is that contemplated?
Generally, that's been contemplated. We have not been funding their participation of other members. They have been working on their own. But we do fund technical support for the project. So if there were to be technical support needed for the plan, the Water Trust would do fundraising for that kind of work. So for instance, if the MOA committee decided that it were appropriate to add water rights to the plan for augmentation, and the water court decree had established a process for any analysis of those water rights, any engineering, then the Water Trust would do fundraising to provide compensation for engineering in support of that.
Eric?
Just to touch on, I think this relates somewhat to what Dan Brown was talking about with respect to how phase 3 looks. We've had a lot of discussions in our group about phase 3 and a lot of these more detailed questions about how it's administered and how it's financed. You get into a bit of a chicken and egg type situation where it's hard to know exactly how to set this up and how to pay for it and those things without knowing what the decree looks like. So, we have had some of those initial discussions, but it's really hard to get to a meaningful level of substance and detail until we get our decree. But I can certainly say, improving flows on the Poudre River through Fort Collins and in our neighboring communities is a long-term policy goal for Fort Collins. And it's something we'll certainly pursue and work on, but it's hard to work through those details until we know specifically, until we have our decree. So.
I would just add maybe more practically that this is an important issue. I think it will get funded. It's a phase 3 sort of a thing, but from my standpoint, I guess, is if we can't get funding for this, then the plan won't operate. So I think that we will find funding because I think there will be plenty of people who have, as Eric's suggesting, a desire to see this plan operate. But if we can't get enough funding to administer the plan, that would surprise me, but then we'll have no plan operating.
Dan, this is Dave Tosky. I would just add that I agree exactly with what you're saying. And there's other processes throughout the state, the Upper Colorado Wild and Scenic, that some of you may be familiar with, learning by doing, processes that are coalitions of water users that have come together to improve streams and be involved in rivers. And so I am confident that it will be funded.
Thank you. Director Brown, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Linda. I'm just in my mind listening to these answers, which I completely understand that it's really hard to know any of the answers until after the decree, but I'm wondering if there is a way as we go through this process for the board to see that MOA phase 3 and understand how this process operates and be able to sign off on that, not because we need to edit what you're doing, but just so that we can make sure that the questions that we have during phase 2 are indeed answered in phase 3. I just don't know how we don't see it. What are your plans for the board to see that agreement in phase 3?
And I can take that one. This is Kaylee. So the phase 3 that MOA hasn't even begun to be drafted yet. So once it is, we can certainly bring it to the board, informational item, comment item. Yeah, we can certainly do that. But I don't know if it's even going to be drafted until after the water court process, or maybe towards the end of the water court process. I don't know quite, when it will make sense for the group to start drafting that. But certainly we can bring it to the board for review.
Okay, that gives me a really good level of comfort, and I would, I guess, think about how to pose that during our board meeting so that it is less an informational item and more of an action item in the future.
Okay.
And I would love to hear from the water users and the other members of the agreement if that gives you discomfort in any way, or if that makes sense to you. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here.
Well, in the way that I would see it is maybe not necessarily an action item, but certainly a comment item from the board. But yeah, I'd like to hear from our partners too. What do you think? Because our next subject is to kind of go through what staff is going to recommend the action that the board will take on Monday at the board meeting.
This is Dave Tossig. I guess my question is, does the CWCB, when it enters any agreement, have a board action on that item? Is that just typical process, Kaylee or Linda?
It depends.
Yeah.
I like for phase 2, we didn't have the board involved with that one. We just had director signature. So it depends. Sometimes it's part of our board process. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Dan?
My thought in hearing that is that I think that makes sense, but what I think would be helpful to know from the CWC board right now, the directors, is if there's anything that in the MOA that is anticipating a phase 3 that you're finding objectionable or that you would like to see. But beyond that, I mean, looking at, I don't know what the processes are for approving the third, but we'll get around to a phase 3 agreement and there'll be an expectation that the CWCB will be a signatory. So I don't know the process there, but that would be the only thing that would concern me right at the moment, is if something about the phase 2 MOA you find objectionable.
Director Brody?
I had a different question or comment. So I want to see if other board members wanted to respond to Dan's. I personally don't have any concerns about what's described.
Director Dutton?
Thanks. I would say that I don't have any concerns about the agreement. I think it's really well written and very thorough and you know, just incredibly well thought out. But I just wonder if it's the responsible thing to do for the board to weigh in, since the agreement does clearly obligate staff time in the future. And so just to have, you know, the board's stamp of approval to say, yeah, this is something we're behind, and this is something that we do want to, you know, make sure that our folks are involved in.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on this topic? Otherwise, we'll go to Director Brody, and then we really do need to move to our next agenda item. Director Brody?
So I want to take a minute to thank you all for being the guinea pigs and being the brave ones to come forward with the first of these proposals. I think part of what you're hearing is that we're all sort of still figuring this process out. And I hope that we're taking this as an opportunity to kind of develop lessons learned, and in particular, to think about what processes we may want going forward to document the board's due diligence. So for example, if it's making sure that there's been a thorough public input process and that the board has had the opportunity to review any comments from the public. I mean, I just, not that that hasn't happened here, but perhaps we need to think about how we want to document that going forward. Similarly with these agreements, when and where and how is it most appropriate for the board to weigh in so that we're providing feedback at the right points in time and not mucking up a process, you know, at the end of the road once all the parties have reached agreement. So that's just some feedback to staff, and thank you for your patience in bearing with us.
Thank you, Director Brody. It is a bit of a balancing act. Kaylee, I think we're ready to move
Okay.
on.
With that, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, there we go. Really quick review on what this project is, the Poudre Flows project. Plan for augmentation, augmenting stream flow, preserving and improving the natural environment to a reasonable degree. We're operating under that new statute, the subsection of 4.5. The stream reach is Cache la Poudre River from the canyon down to the confluence with the South Platte River. We've got 55 stream miles in Larimer and Weld counties. Of course, we know there's a water court application, and the contractual interest of the seed water is from Fort Collins, Greeley, and Thornton. Those will be included in the water court application. Here's a quick map that you've seen before. You will see again with the different seed water reaches. So this is a abbreviated version of what we'll be asking the board. A staff recommendation for the meeting on Monday. And so just to kind of focus in on what we're asking the board, this is again, I guess I appreciate Dr. Brody's and Dr. Brown's comments on, what is the due diligence? What is it that the board needs to do here? The statute has all sorts of terms and conditions language, and I think that will mostly be addressed in water court, but there are specific things that we will be asking the board to do, which are important, which cannot be done anywhere else. So for the augmentation plan itself, the board will need to determine the flow rates. So we're going to recommend that the board determine the flow rates that are recommended by Colorado Parks and Wildlife are appropriate to preserve and improve the natural environment to a reasonable degree within that subject reach. So it's the flow rates and the reach. Secondly, we'll ask the board to direct us, staff, to work with the AG's office and with our co-applicants to file the water court application for the augmentation plan, and also to include these specific seed water rates in that application. For the seed water rates themselves, now these are our acquisitions of 3 sets of seed water rates. So firstly, to conclude that the use of those inquired seed water rates is appropriate to preserve and improve the natural environment up to the recommended flow rates, the CPW flow rates, and it's best utilized by protecting the water through the reach, consistent with all those terms and conditions. And these are terms and conditions of the underlying decrees, the change decrees of the underlying seed water rates, and this new augmentation plan decree that will be set through the water court process. And finally, to accept the interest in the water, to authorize our CWCB director to execute the water delivery agreements. And all of the backup documents for all of these are attached to the November board meeting memos, and I know those were at least a couple hundred pages or more of attachments, and so all the draft documents we're pointing back to that November board meeting for those. So I'll touch briefly on the water court process, and then we'll open it back up for discussion. So the water court application, it's in your document, but I went ahead and took a couple of snippets off of it. It shows who the co-applicants are: the Cache la Poudre Water Users Association, the cities of Fort Collins, Greeley, and Thornton, Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District is also a co-applicant, even though they're not bringing seed water to the plan at this point, and of course CWCB. And the title of the There, the caption of the application is the same as is required in statute. It's an application for approval of a plan for augmentation. That's normal. The new part is to augment stream flows on the Cache la Poudre River pursuant to that specific statute. The way we'll present the seed water rights in the application, sorry, this is a little bit blurry. This is just a cut and paste out of the application. That the water rights to be used for augmentation will include these particular seed water rights, and then there's a paragraph or two on each. The Fort Collins, Southside Ditch water rights, Greeley Irrigation Company water rights, and Thornton's TMP decree. Then there's a paragraph in the application, kind of marking the point where we will be negotiating actually the procedures to include future water rights in the plan. And this is pursuant to the statute 3058C that was also adjusted in the or edited in the new bill to include this type of a plan for augmentation. So I think that's it for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll open that one back up for discussion. So I know we want to talk about kind of the MOA again and any board action, staff recommendations, and the water court process.
Director Hawkins?
Thanks, Linda. Kaylee, would you mind putting up this slide that has the actual like staff recommendation for board decisions on it?
Yes. Now this is abbreviated. The actual recommendations will be word for word out of the board memos, which are, paragraphs long.
Yeah. So this is sort of going back to the discussion that we were having, and sorry, I was thinking hard when I was listening to the other board members. I wanted to note that the decisions that are in front of the board next week are really specific to things like directing staff to file the water court application. And I just, as the board members think through that question of the board input, I want to push back a little bit on some of the discussions about staffing and recognize that we have a really talented director of our agency who's on the board, whose job it is to think about how staff resources are allocated, and that we do not as a board regularly review either across the board how CWCB is staffed or how DNR makes staffing decisions. So I want to put it in the board members' head as we're thinking about our role and touch points, that I personally feel really strongly that Becky is in charge of how the agency is staffed, and it is not an appropriate policy role for the board to step in unless we're going to start doing it sort of across the agency. So I wanted to make that comment today.
Can I say something echoing that just a bit? And Director Hawkins, I really appreciate that comment, and that is accurate. And just so that everyone on this workshop is aware, I take the input from the board as we look at our staffing. And so while we, there are so many things and levers that are going on across the agency, it's important that we have the flexibility to kind of manage that in a way that not only meets kind of the direction of the board, but the direction also of our mission and overall DNR. So I appreciate your comments on that, Director Hawkins.
Thank you. Director Dutton?
Thanks, Linda. My question is for the division engineer, if he's on, or just some DWR staff, if anybody is available. Sorry that I can't scroll through and see everybody's faces quickly. So on page 8 of item 23 from our November packet, there's the subject of administrability. Let's see, now I'm lost. Okay, thank you. Of the decree. And so this seems like the appropriate time to ask this question. It's noted that the division engineer said that the proposal appears to be administrable, provided that, and then there were a bunch of conditions that, there's appropriate terms to prevent injury, adequate measurement, necessary infrastructure, and communication protocols. And so I just am curious, since it to me seemed like the memo kind of left that open, that was the division engineer's comment that he would be okay as long as the decree had these components. But now that we're looking at the decree, I just wanted to confirm if this decree as written is sufficient to meet the division engineer's parameters here.
Yes, and if I may comment on that.
Please do.
Yeah, great question, Director Dutton. This is Corey DeAngelis, Division Engineer, Division 1. And I'll echo what State Engineer Kevin Ryan said earlier. We've been involved in the outreach thus far, and meeting with the applicants, the co-applicants, and CWCB. What we're looking at is an application and some things in concept. We have quite a ways to go through the process before there is a final decree. So we're hopeful to work out a lot of the details. As Dan Brown said earlier, this is something new. We understand it in concept and we're working through those details. We feel, as with all decrees that we were charged with administering, that we always want clear language, but we also want the flexibility that we can operate something, because no matter how much time and effort we put into it, I'm sure we're not going to think of everything. So we want to be careful not to pin ourselves in on our administration and operation, and be able to administer the river and all the decrees as they historically have, including this decree. So we feel, as we do with most decrees, as long as there's clear language on how we administer in the decree, that's what we'll be after. That provides us guidance to properly administer, and that includes, proper measurement and recording devices, accounting and reporting, if you will, and communication. I think Dan Brown mentioned, the groups working together have already recognized that, we don't want to have a phone call or get calls from every member of that group. We'll focus with the water users, as historically has occurred with the water commissioner and the water users. So we feel, confident. We'll participate, as we do in all water court cases, in the drafting of those terms and conditions in the decree, but we'll be focused that they're clear, so we can administer them per the decree.
Thanks, Corey. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Director Yan, do you have a comment?
I do. Thanks, Linda. I just want everybody to keep in mind that while this is new for in-stream flow purposes, this is not new on the South Platte or the Poudre River. So as Corey said, they get involved in water court cases all the time to make sure that it's administrable and that everything's done right, that water is bypass structures. On the South Platte, especially in our area, from Kersey to the state line, so 180 mile-ish stretch of river, we have augmentation plans that put water in for well replacements, and we have to shepherd that through diversion structures. So this isn't anything new, and Division 1, Corey, does an excellent job of making sure that people submit their accounting, making sure that it's done correctly. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that this is new for us within the in-stream flow realm, but for the South Platte and Poudre River as a whole, it's not that new. So, this legislation just allowed for augmentation use in the in-stream flow. A lot of us thought that the CWCB could have done this without any legislation at all, because in-stream flow is a beneficial use. So, but to make sure that happened, the legislation came through. And so So anyway, just to reassure everyone that our division engineer does an excellent job on our river.
Thank you, Director Jan. It looks like we're ready to move on to the next agenda item.
Okay, technicalities, I'm coming. Okay, so agenda item 3 is, this is something that the board definitely needs to focus on, which is the flow recommendations by CPW. So we will be asking the board to make findings here. One sec. Which way is this thing going? All right, I got kicked off. Hold on. Okay, I'm about to hand it over to Katie. One sec, Katie.
No worries. If you're having issues, I can try presenting. Oh, there we go.
Okay, there we go. Now it should work. Okay, take it over, Katie.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Katie Birch. I'm the In-Stream Flow Program Coordinator for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we'll be briefly touching on the biological flow recommendations for this reach of the Poudre and how they were developed. Next slide, Kaylee. So, as was discussed, there's a long history on the Poudre of interested stakeholders working towards a solution. Dry up through the subject reach at multiple points makes the Poudre a tough place to be a fish. Diversity and abundance of our native species have declined historically as these fish are challenged by a highly manipulated river exhibiting severe low flow. So CPW is very appreciative of the efforts of the stakeholders to restore flows on the Poudre and improve upon this habitat fragmentation. So how do we quantify how much water is necessary to preserve the natural environment and improve the natural environment to a reasonable degree? That's what I'll talk about in the next few slides. So the subject reach is 55 miles long, over which there's significant diversity in the river characteristics, gradient, substrate, channel geometry, and the composition of the fishery. In November, I talked about how the fishery composition changes across the reach. So I won't go into that again, but will say it can be categorized into 3 zones. The high gradient zone, or mountain stream, where you find cold water trout, the transition zone, and the plain zone. Most of the subject reach is within the transition zone, and transition zones are an ecologically important aquatic habitat. They provide thermal and flow conditions suitable for cold water species seasonally moving downstream and warm water species seasonally moving upstream, and species that are unique to the transition zone alone. These 3 species on the bottom of the slide are State Wildlife Action Plan high conservation priority fish that the Poudre is home to. So in addition to these pictured species of interest, the Poudre is home to a host of other sucker, minnow, and darter species. Next slide. So in November, I also discussed the differences between PHAB-SIM and R2 Cross and where the data sets on the Poudre come from. Both of these approaches are well-established methodologies for quantifying flow needs in Colorado and other states. On the Poudre, we used a combination of R2 Cross and PHAB-SIM. The PHAB-SIM representative reaches are shown in purple. An R2 Cross was collected at 6 sites, the stars, which I think got a little bit off, but all above I-25. The reason R2 Cross is not collected east of I-25 is because the Poudre becomes very channelized and low gradient, and those types of hydraulics are more accurately described with PHAB-SIM. Also, the warm water species assemblages present in the Poudre below I-25 utilize habitat types such as large pools and lower gradient runs and glides that are more accurately described with PHAB-SIM. So in the upper reaches, R2 was used to assess the low end of the target range or preserve, since it's considered to recommend flows that are suboptimal. PHAB-SIM curves can be used to determine optimal flows or kind of an up to improved range beyond which additional flows have detrimental effects on fish habitat. And I'll show more of what I mean on the next slide.
Hey, my fault for the stars getting off. I stretched the map and I stretched it away from the stars. Sorry.
No worries, they're not all that accurate anyways.
Here's the next map. There.
So in the Nature of Time, I pulled out 2 examples of PHAB-SIM data sets. This first example is segment A, and we're looking at a representative reach and PHAB-SIM, and we have the weighted usable area, WUA versus float relationship for different species analyzed. So in segment A, we're looking at adult and juvenile brown and rainbow trout, trout fry, and suckers and long-nosed dace, our warm water species. So essentially what we're doing here is we're looking for an inflection point on all of these curves where when you add additional flow, you're actually reducing preferred habitat. So what we try to do is strike a balance for different species, obviously have different optimal flow targets. So we tried to recommend a range that wasn't overly detrimental for any one species. So trout fry generally kind of are seeking out those margins on the side of the river. So, you know, their preferred habitat is somewhat stable and it's declining the more flow we had, and that's kind of just a reality. So we tried to seek a balance between juveniles and adults in some of the warm water species. And then on segment E, similarly, towards the bottom of the reach and the confluence of the South Platte, we lose our management focus on those cold water trout species. So we're just looking at warm water species here, and there's a lot less going on as far as preferred habitat. These species like lower velocity, higher depth areas, and so you see a much less defined kind of inflection point in the weighted usable area curves. And so in segment D, E, and F, we're really looking at these darter species. Those are a management objective for CPW. Iowa darter is a species of concern, as well as Johnny darter. And so we kind of defined our range as what would maximize habitat for the darter and wasn't overly problematic for any other species, seeing that these are all kind of stable preferred habitat zones. So those were the 2 examples I pulled out. On the next slide, I'll show kind of the summary table for winter and summer preserve and improve flow rates. And really the meat of kind of this analysis and methodology is within our quantification report. It kind of outlines all of those decisions that were made. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about the fishery or how we develop those flow recommendations.
I am not seeing anyone indicating that they have a question, because we can wait another moment.
I think right after this discussion, we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break. So if anybody has questions for Katie, you can bring them up now, or we can also bring them up at the end after we go through the seed water reports.
I have a comment, if I could. Just Katie, that great job. That is, it's really difficult, I think, to find a balance that supports cold water and warm water species, and working in a river corridor where you're really transitioning from sort of a more of a mountain stream with a higher current velocity into more of that high plains environment. And I just think you did a nice job of striking a balance there and getting into, you know, finding that those flows that will preserve and improve and basically do no harm to anybody, any of these species. So thank you. It made really good sense to me. And I think this is right on track.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments. That Director Dutton did put a comment in the chat that Katie, you should read.
Well, thank you all for your time and appreciate it.
Oh, one note real quick is that those up in the upper reaches are the same flow recommendation numbers that we used in the northern case for Glide Reservoir protected mitigation releases. So we're consistent with the previous board findings for those flow rates. So with that, I think we're due another 5-minute break. It's been about another hour. Let's take a 5-minute break and come back, and then we'll dive into the engineering for our last hour. Thanks. Okay, I wasn't watching for the exact 5 minutes, but I think it's been 5 minutes. Since we are, well, on our actual schedule, we're an hour behind, but I think we're ahead because we've already asked a lot of, had a lot of the discussion that we were going to do at the end. So we'll get right on it here. So next up is Greg Sullivan is going to kind of go through a little bit of the engineering and get this to work right. Okay, agenda item 5. Let me know if anybody wants me to stop, but otherwise I'll just go ahead. And actually we're going to hand it over to Greg.
Thank you, Kaylee. My name is Greg Sullivan. I'm with Sprunk Water Engineers, and I'm assisting on this project in some of the technical and engineering aspects. I gave a more detailed presentation of some of the technical issues at the November meeting, and today I'm just going to follow up with a few more things and also allow some questions for what I had gone over the last time. Since the last meeting, I was asked to put together some schematic illustrations of what this augmentation looks like, and that's what this slide is going to get into. The concept is pretty straightforward, but I think some of these graphic illustrations might further cement what we're doing here. So in this first slide, at this graphic at the top, what we have is a reach of the stream where we have water flowing in from the left and exiting to the right. And think of the blue area as just being the existing flow on a particular day. And so in this particular example, we have a situation where there's no diversions, existing diversions going on in the reach. And so if we could then conceptualize this water as being the augmentation water from, say, one of these seed water sources is delivered into the river. And as we've talked about, this is new water that wasn't in the reach previously because it had been diverted and used and consumed, and in most cases for the seed water, it's historical irrigation water rights. So this is water now that is no longer, it's not going to be not being used for the historical irrigation uses anymore, but now is being delivered into the river and then run down the river to some downstream point for another use. And that other use could be a rediversion for some use that the city is making of the water downstream, or water that's being used to pay a return flow obligation downstream. And so within the place where the water is delivered into the stream and taken out of the stream, or used for that downstream purpose, it's protected from diversion by others. And in the meantime, then it is, you know, while that water's in the river, of course, it's increasing the flow in the river. So then, just to show then some other examples of when there are other uses occurring within the river, we have this second slide. And so in this case, we have the augmentation water being delivered into the river and used downstream, just as in the above example. But in this case, we have an existing diversion from the river occurring midway down the reach. And so we have the existing flow coming in, being boosted by the augmentation water, and then water being diverted. And this would be an example of a place where previously there was a dry up at the point of diversion from the river. And now we have this additional protected flow in the river that is increasing the flow beyond what would otherwise be there, and protect it until we get on downstream. And then a third example that I've put in here was a situation where there's an exchange. And so the same water being delivered into the river and used for downstream purpose, this augmentation water, just as before. And here then we have water coming into the reach, the blue area, and then we have an exchange diversion happening. So that's the right to the left where it says exchange potential. That would be water being diverted out of the river. And historically, that exchange may have been causing a dry up of the river. And so now we have some protected flow within that exchange reach. And just for this exchange, then its operation, of course, we're taking water out upstream, and then that operator of that exchange then is putting water back into the stream and restoring the flow downstream. But what these exchanges, of course, can do is deplete the flow in between where water is taken out and put back in. And this augmentation water then can function to protect the river or increase the flow within that exchange reach, while still allowing that historical exchange to occur just as it did in the past. So that's just a hypothetical example to help illustrate what's operating or what's happening here with these augmentation deliveries.
Greg, Director Trick has a question.
Okay.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, I was going to see if you could go back to that slide there. So on number 3, you mentioned that existing exchanges wouldn't be affected, but what would be the effect on any new exchanges in that reach under condition number 3 there?
Well, I think a new exchange could still occur, but it could not exchange against that protected water. So in the third example, if a previous exchange was already using up all the exchange potential, then no additional exchange could occur within that reach because there wouldn't be an exchange potential left. And the reach would be, and the augmentation water would be protected in that reach and could not be exchanged upon either.
Thank you.
Director Dutton.
Hey, Greg, thanks for being here again and for your presentation. I was just curious how you chose your study period for your model?
So that's getting into our point flow model that I got into previously, and that I'll be talking a little bit more about here in the rest of my presentation. But our study period for that that we used was 2002 to near the present, and that was chosen for two reasons. One is we have good daily flow data for most of the diversions through all of diversions and returns through that period. Also, because it's relatively recent, then it reflects the current regime of the river and the current operations of the river. And so, and it also contains, a number of wet, dry, and average type flow conditions, so that I think are representative of the variety of conditions that exist.
Thank you.
Greg, please proceed.
Okay. So this next slide, this is a result of the point, what we call the point flow modeling that we had done on the Poudre River to help identify the need for augmentation water throughout the reach. And so this graphic was an illustration of the flows in the river, and this is a presentation tool that we developed to help illustrate flows throughout the reach of the entire reach and throughout the entire period of a year. In this case, it's 2002. And so what the labels at the top then are identifying the points on the river from the canyon mouth gauge and at the left side all the way down to the near Greeley gauge, which is near the confluence of the river. So we have 5 gauges in this reach, and they're labeled in that gray color. And then the other locations along the top there are points of diversion that are shown in labeled in red, and points of return that are labeled in black. And so what we did through this point flow modeling is used the historical gauge flows plus the records of diversions and returns, and then use this process that's pretty well established to then use that information to estimate the flow at all of these points in between, so that we have flow estimates not only at the gauges, but at all the other locations along the river. And then the information presented on this chart is actual daily information. So there's 365 rows of colored information shown on here, and the colors then just represent the historical flows, in this case in the year 2002 at all of these locations. The color coding is shown in the upper left. So the white areas are places where there is no flow. And then the various color coding, the light green is 10, or the lightest green is 0 to 10 CFS. And we have the next little darker color green is 10 to 30 CFS. And then, getting into the blue is 30 to 50, 50 to 150, 150 to 260. And so this color coding, then you can kind of see at a glance what the flows were during this entire year from the top of the reach to the bottom of the reach. And what is evident is even in 2002, for example, you have the snowmelt runoff coming in from the left side, and that's those darker colors during May, June, and July. And you can see how those colors then lighten as you go downstream, as that water is diverted and taken out of the river. And then another characteristic that you see in these two is that the flows then, become generally lightest in the middle of the reach in that what we've called segment C. But then as the irrigation return flows come back into the stream downstream, you can see the colors getting dark, somewhat darker, although there's some variation, but as the return flows come back and help restore the stream flows going downstream. So we have these kinds of illustrations for all of the years in our study period, but this is just the flows for 2002, which was a very dry year. And so we use this information then to identify the need for water, in the sense that we have from Katie the flow rates that are desirable to preserve and improve the aquatic habitat. So if we just compare those flows that Katie identified to the existing flows and compute the difference, then we can compute what we've called deficits, the deficit between what the flow is there versus the preserve and improve flows. And that's what's shown on this stream flow deficit heat map for that same year, 2002. So what we've done here is, if you look at towards the top, I've got those improved flow rates. That's the upper limit rates that Katie had identified. So, 150 to 260 CFS, depending on the season, and reach 8, and reach A, or segment A, I should say, and in segment B. And then the flows are lower in C, 54 CFS in the summer and winter, 40 CFS in segment D in the summer and winter, and then down in segment E, the flow rates are 30 CFS. And so if we're just taking those improved flow rates minus the flow that is there, we compute the deficit, and then the amounts of those deficits are color coded by flow rate. So where it's bright white, that means there is no deficit, that the existing flows are at or above the improved flow rates. And then the colors then, where they show up, then illustrate the amount of the deficit, with the darker colors being a greater deficit. So anytime there's a color shown on here, that indicates that there's a need for additional flow, and that these augmentation deliveries would be a benefit in those segments of the stream. So yeah, so that was a sort of a synopsis of what I had presented in some more detail the last time, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
I am not seeing any questions. So perhaps we can move to the next item. Oh.
Okay, the next item will be,
Kaylee, Mr. Wambacher, I think we need to wait until public comment to address your questions, but we will address them. So please hold them.
So our last 3 items are to go through Fort Collins, Greeley, and Thornton seed water rights and how they'll be used. And then we'll go straight to the public comments and open discussion. So I'm gonna forward this one and turn it over to Eric Patiandi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Patiandi. I'm here on behalf of the City of Fort Collins. I'm one of their attorneys, and as all water attorneys, I'm here to do a little bit of high-level water engineering summaries. I'm here to describe the seed water rights Fort Collins is proposing to donate to this plan under a draft agreement we have with the CWCB that I believe will be coming before you again at the next meeting. The water rights Fort Collins is referring to here are water rights represented by shares in 3 ditch companies: the Arthur Irrigation Company, the Larimer County No. 2 Irrigating Company, and the New Mercer Ditch Company. These water rights are often referred, these ditch companies are often referred to in Fort Collins as the south side ditch companies, because they divert water from the south side of the Poudre River, as I'll show, as you can see on the map here. I'm kind of at the upper end of the reach, and because they kind of flow through the heart of Fort Collins. These water rights were quantified and changed in Water Court Case 2005 CW 323. I would note that the city of Fort Collins and a few other entities have other change cases on these ditches as well, though they're not the subject of the Poudre Flows Plan or this agreement. And as I think I mentioned, the historical use was quantified in this case in these water rights, and they were changed from the historical irrigation use to a bunch of additional new uses, including all municipal uses for Fort Collins, as well as for augmentation use. The decree in this case was entered in 2014, and since the decree was entered, all of these water rights have continued to be diverted into the ditches as they were historically. You might wonder why we changed water rights and haven't begun using them yet. That's because we are planning for growth as we reach build out, and these water rights will be used in the Fort Collins municipal system as we grow into them in the coming years. Sort of the way this change decree is structured is that on an annual basis, Fort Collins identifies how many of the shares will be used for new uses for the coming year. We provide notice to the division engineer in an annual operating plan. And then as soon as we place these to new uses, the portion of the water rights that are placed to new uses are no longer diverted into the ditches as they occurred historically, and we incur return flow obligations on the new diversions for the new uses. There's both a surface return flow obligation, which is basically an immediate obligation concurrent with the diversions, and then a delayed subsurface return flow obligation. So one way to think about the water we divert under these water rights is there's really kind of 3 components. There's a consumptive use component, what you might call a surface return flow component, and a subsurface return flow component. The way we propose to operate under the agreement with the Poudre Flows Plan is pretty straightforward. Water attributable to the seed water rights would be left in the river at the original points of diversion. You can see those kind of up here. The New Mercer Ditch and the Larimer No. 2 Ditch share a common diversion dam and sort of parallel each other. So that's essentially one point there. And then the Arthur Ditch diverts a little ways downstream at a separate point of diversion. There are numerous alternate points of diversion in our change of water right decree, but we would not be utilizing those with the Poudre Flows Plan. So we would essentially leave our whole diversion in the river, all 3 components, the consumptive use component, and the surface and subsurface return flow components. The water would then be shepherded downstream, and while it is in the river, it would augment stream flows, as Greg discussed. And while it was being conveyed, it would be reduced by transit losses, as other deliveries are. You can sort of see on the map the one main intervening diversion in this for these water rights would be the Larimer and Weld Canal, and that would be an issue we would need to work through. And And so once our water reaches the end, the bottom area of our reach here at the Fossil Creek Reservoir inlet ditch, we would redivert a portion of our water for storage in one of our gravel pit reservoirs. You recall I sort of mentioned there's sort of three portions of the diversion. There's a consumptive use portion, a surface return flow portion, and a subsurface return flow portion. We would typically redivert the consumptive use portion into storage, and we would redivert the subsurface return flow portion into storage so that we could release it later as required by our change of water right decree. We would leave the surface return flow portion in the river to meet our surface return flow obligations. And that is really the heart of it. I would just mention, that is the current proposal, and we've worked through the issues with CWCB staff. Fort Collins, we have some creative folks, and we have other ideas that we would like to propose in the future. But at the moment, we want to use these as seed water rights and kind of start small and see what we can help this program become.
Are there any questions for Eric? Sorry, Kaylee.
And Linda, I was thinking maybe we go ahead and go through Greeley and Thornton's and do maybe some combined question, because we may have a member of the public who wants to speak too. So
we do have one question from Director Trick, but then I think it'd be a good idea to do what you suggest. Okay. Director Trick.
Thank you, Linda. And thanks, Eric, for participating in this meeting and presenting to us. I just have a question about the changed water rights. And you mentioned that, it's the South Side Ditches Decree 05 CW33. Has Fort Collins done a thorough analysis of the terms and conditions in that decree to make sure that it can be, that water can be operated in this plan without violating those terms and conditions?
In short, yes. Fort Collins has been involved in these discussions on the Poudre Flows Plan really since the beginning. I think it was 2014, 2013. And when the concept of what water we could use as Fort Collins could include in this plan, we've been sort of doing that type of analysis since we began looking at that. We, based on our understanding of our decree and our review of it, this is all consistent with our decree, and we would be able to meet return flow obligations and other obligations under the decree. So, yes.
If Linda will allow me one follow-up to Eric specifically, I'll try to. Okay. Thanks, Eric. And I'm assuming that this water, when it was changed in the 05 case, Fort Collins was planning on pulling that in and using it in a municipal system. So donating this water to this plan, or I guess I wouldn't say donating, but dedicating this water to this plan at this time, what happens when Fort Collins needs to call in that water to its municipal system in regards to this plan? And when would you expect that to occur?
Well, so the way the agreement with the CWCB is structured, it sort of parallels how the decree is structured, so that on an annual basis in the spring, when we determine how many of the change shares we are going to use for municipal uses, we would at that same time determine how many we would include in the Poudre Flows Plan. And so that would be sort of determined on an annual basis, the sort of specific amount. Over time, as we grow into the need for these, it would sort of depend on the year. my general understanding as just an attorney, not an engineer, is that, you know, and typically an average in wet years, Fort Collins at times has water it doesn't need to divert into its municipal system, but at times it, so in a lot of years, I think we would potentially be able to do this. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of big uncertainties in the Poudre River and for Fort Collins in particular, as we're trying to get our Halligan Reservoir enlarged. Some of this water would be stored in Halligan Reservoir in the future. So it's hard to say, but I think, you know, at least in the immediate future, my understanding is that we would be able to include a pretty significant portion of these water rights in the Poudre Flows Plan, determining exactly how much on an annual basis. And then going forward, you know, I think we would be, you know, I'm pretty sure my client will continue to be inclined to find other ways to include water in this plan.
Thank you, Eric. I think that perhaps we should move on to Greeley.
And Jen is up.
Good morning. I'm Jen Petrzalka, Water Resources Operations Manager for Greeley. We're proposing to dedicate shares that we own in the Greeley Irrigation Company. We own 125 shares, which is about a little under 2,200 acre feet a year, about 5.5 CFS a day throughout the season. We've historically diverted it through the GIC headgate, and we would continue to do that and release it at our F Street return structure, which is about 1.7 miles below the headgate. And it would travel throughout section F to the confluence with the South Platte, where we would meet return flows and augmentation obligations. And that is about that is our operations. I don't know if there's any questions on that, but pretty simple.
I'm not seeing any questions, and maybe we should move on to Thornton so that we can just have all the questions at the end.
Hey, thank you, Linda. My name is Emily Hunt. I'm the Deputy Infrastructure Director for the City of Thornton. Thornton is proposing to use water rights that we acquired in the Water Supply and Storage Company DIP system. We changed the water rights. Actually, Kaylee, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, thanks. We quantified and changed the full shares of those water supply and storage company shares from agricultural to fully consumable municipal use. Currently, the water is being used for irrigation still within the Water Supply and Storage Company system. And it's upon municipal conversion of these shares and delivery to Thornton when we propose to utilize the seed water or commit the seed water to the proposed augmentation plan. So our concept is upon municipal conversion, we'll replace our return flows that are owed at various locations along the Poudre at a location high up in the river, farther upstream than where they're owed. We'll add water to cover transit losses, and it's in those reaches between the point of delivery of the return flows owed to the point of where they're actually owed, where the water will be used to for the augmentation plan. This will happen over a very long period of time. Thornton's plan for municipal conversion of these shares will begin in 2025 and will probably extend out until beyond 2065, be kind of a staged conversion. And so the initial amount of water that'll be added to the stream is relatively small, but it'll ramp up to a maximum of around 2,200 acre feet a year and around 9.5 CFS at certain times of the season, once all of our shares are being converted to municipal use. So if we go to the next map, it might be a little bit easier to see. Our system is pretty big. This is a similar map to what you've been seeing of the Poudre River you see the in-stream flow reaches A through F identified on the map. The triangles on the map are the different locations that Thornton's decree requires us to pay return flows. So you can see, you know, as high up as the Larimer and Weld Canal, all the way down to the confluence with the South Platte River. And so basically our decree just says that we need to make sure that we're making certain return flow releases at these points of location. Just a little bit more orientation, the blue squiggly on the top of the map is the Water Supply and Storage Company system this main canal, the Larimer County Canal, as well as the associated laterals. And then the black squares and polygons that you see on the map, those are the Thornton farms. Those are the farms that we currently own that are currently being irrigated with this Water Supply and Storage Company shares. If you go to the next slide, this shows you that these farms right now, the irrigation of these farms is causing return flows to accrue to these points on the Poudre naturally through surface water return flows as well as subsurface water return flows. So that's what's happening current day. This water is in the river at these locations in the currently. And so then if we go to the next slide, upon municipal conversion, rather than moving that water to the farms, Thornton will be releasing it high, as I mentioned, in the Poudre where this green dot is. That's the Larimer County head gate, and it'll be released directly into the river at that location. So in this instance, the return flow is owed at the Larimer and Weld Canal. So that's the location that we have to have that return flow delivered, but it's that entire stretch from the Larimer County Canal head gate to the Larimer and Weld Canal. We'll be able to use that delivery of that return flow through that stretch as part of the augmentation plan. So the next slide shows the return flow from the upper Cache la Poudre being delivered to the Fossil Creek Inlet, and then the following one to the Greeley number 2 canal, and then Kaylee can keep going. It's just our little animation. Our return flow owed to the middle Cache, to the Ogilvie, and then finally the South Platte confluence. And so the concept is, rather than Thornton delivering this water directly to these locations through a variety of means that we are allowed to do under our decree, when we're operating with the Poudre in-stream flow augmentation plan, we'll make all of those releases as high in the river as possible. And then that release combined with stream loss additions will allow our return flow releases to supplement this augmentation plan. So that's what I wanted to describe. I think the next map is just kind of the regular map that we've been seeing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
And to let the board know, that concludes the presentation portion. So we'll do board questions now, and then we'll go to public comments.
I am not, excuse me, I am not seeing any questions from the board. And I think that Kevin Ryan and Corey DeAngelis, maybe this would be a good time for them to answer the questions that Bill Wambacher posted in the chat at 11:17 a.m. You can scroll up to see those questions. Unless a board member has a question first, which I'm not seeing in the chat.
Linda, pardon me, I'd be happy to start with Bill Wambacher's question if you're ready for me to jump in.
I believe we are. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, because it sounds like a few other folks may have the same question. And in general, I recall as the legislation was developing, and I can certainly point to it now, and I believe it's, sorry, the statutory reference just escaped me again, but it's on page 3 of the bill, I believe, and sorry, indulge me, 3792-102 4.5b Roman numeral 8. And so that's where we see explicitly that the augmentation water is subject to such reasonable transit losses as may be imposed by the water court or the state and division engineers. And so for all our division engineers, especially Corey, the need to impose transit losses and administer that as water is being delivered through a stream reach is not new. So that would be one of those items that I talked about as we do our summary of consultation work and stay involved in the case that would be imposed. And with that, I guess I'd leave it to Corey whether you have something to add to that.
Yeah, Kevin, I agree with everything you said. I might add that, you know, as I think Director Jan pointed out, this is something we do quite often throughout the basin. That's deliver water, shepherd water, operate exchanges. So I believe we'd continue to assess transit like we historically have. The water commissioner would assess the conditions on the stream. We would look at either available or future measurement and recording devices to confirm that assessment's adequate and adjust if necessary. And I think the presentation is contemplating, and I assume the application and then the final decree will lay out those quantification points or those measurement points on the stream. I think the transparency in some instances would either be the reporting or telemetry on some of those structures. But yeah, we would assess transit losses on these deliveries as we do with all the other water we're shepherding or moving through the stream.
Thank you, Corey. Are there any follow-up questions on this topic? And I think we are morphing into the public comment portion. Mr. Wambacher, I think it might be more effective for you to just state your question, please, at this point.
Sure. Sorry, Linda, I wasn't sure how you wanted to do this. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
So my question is simply, it sounded like in some of the descriptions of how the seed water was going to be operated, and I think this came up in Greeley's description, it sounded like the water was going to be bypassed at the ditch company head gate, if I heard that correctly, which is a manner of operation that is not something that's typical because it has impacts to other shareholders. I know when my clients do change cases, it's never an option. So I'm just curious if that's actually how this is going to operate, if it's been discussed with the ditch companies and whether the ditch companies have approved of that.
So the proposal is not to bypass it. We would still continue to divert it and then divert it at a return flow structure. We haven't discussed it with the dish company yet, but it is part of our decree that we could do that sort of operation. I don't know, Dan, if you want to add to that.
Yes, just to clarify, there are two change decrees. The first change decree, Greeley decreed a number of APODs that it is not used and does not plan to use for the operations contemplated by this AUG plan. The second change decree actually requires that shares, even after they're converted to the changed uses, continue to be diverted at the head gate of the number 3. So the water for Greeley's seed water operations anyway will continue to be diverted at the head gate, not bypassed.
Thank you. That's helpful. Perhaps I misunderstood.
Ryan Donovan has said that he'd like to address the board, and I forgot to ask, when you address the board with your public comment, can you please state your name and who you represent? Thank you. Mr. Donovan, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks, apologize about that. Brian Donovan on behalf of Larimer & Weld Irrigation Company, Larimer & Weld Reservoir Company, and WRCC Inc. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address the board this morning. I guess I just have a couple of preliminary observations that I would like the directors to consider. I guess first and foremost, I appreciate what Dan has said about preserving the status quo on the Poudre River. And I trust that is the intent, but I guess I'm struggling to get my head wrapped around how that intent will be implemented or I guess administered on the river. And I'm speaking from some recent experience with Northern Waters pending protective mitigation release case. And by that I mean, as has been said on this call several times already, the Poudre is overly appropriated. And not only that, there is tremendous amount of variability in the flows, particularly during the irrigation season when a lot of the senior ditches are scrambling to get their water. So it is an administrative tightrope, for lack of a better term, but the senior diverters and the commissioners seem to have figured out a system that works. And so now we're overlaying not only this Northern Waters PMR releases, but now this augmentation water, and we're calling those protected. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what we mean by protected. In my mind, that doesn't mean that those flows are exempt from the effects of the variability on the river on any given day. And to Mr. Wambacher's point, particularly the effects of transit loss. So all water users on this stretch take their lumps, and I would expect that the protected rights would be treated similarly. Otherwise, I think what is being proposed is that all of that risk and the variability is going to be pushed on to the senior diverters who are going to be asked to potentially bypass water that they are lawfully entitled to or permitted to exchange upon. And to me, that is the definition of injury. So that's my first comment, I guess. Second, my law partner, Brad Grasmick, provided a letter to Kaylee and yourself, Linda, and the subject of that letter was really that we would like to see the CWCB conduct some level of diligence on these seed rights and whether they can be used for the purposes claimed in this pending application or this to-be pending application. And I think the concern there is that a lot of these change decrees were approved at a time when protecting flows in the river wasn't on anybody's radar, wasn't a consideration. So, what are the terms and conditions that are going to be imposed or thinking of being imposed going forward to divert this water, to administer this water, to measure it, and all of those things? And I guess what I've heard is that, well, we'll just figure that out in water court. And well, that costs money for the water users to have to to do that. And I would hope that the CWCB would have done some further investigations. Particularly, it seems like there's already a draft application ready to go. So it would be helpful for us to have an understanding of what those terms and conditions and what some of that analysis is about the ability of these water rights, these seed water rights, to be used in this manner. Just two more, if I may, Linda, just two more comments. The third one I have is I'm particularly confused by Thornton's proposal for their seed water rights. It seems to me that what is, the primary thrust of what's being proposed here is new water to the system. Just putting your return flows in upstream from where the road, to me, isn't new water. That's a recoloring of the water. And so I think that sets a pretty dangerous precedent going forward where can anybody now going forward claim the right to protect their return flows? So I just ask that the board consider that. And then finally, the other kind of last point I have here in my notes is it seems that the CPW flow recommendations for this augmentation plan are the same as those being used in Northern's PMR case. And from what I can tell from conversations with Northern, is those releases, the PMR releases are going to be made when Glade is built. So it almost seems like those are just going to be happening. And I guess at a high level, my question is, if Northern is already kind of meeting those flow targets, then what is, you know, is this augmentation plan that's being proposed and discussed today really necessary to help meet those stream flow recommendations? Or maybe a better way to think about it is, can those PMR stream flows somehow be combined with what's being proposed here with this augmentation plan to increase efficiencies, right? So instead of having now these two kind of super rights hanging out there, there's just kind of one protected release that meets those CPW flow recommendations. And I may have additional comments. I took a lot of notes today, but those were the four that stuck out to me. So thank you for allowing me to address the board. I appreciate it.
And thanks, Mr. Donovan. I'll take over here for Linda for a bit. Let's take those in order. The first question, I would look to either the state engineer or the division engineer to provide the first response there.
Thanks, Director Hawkins. And can you just clarify, Ryan had a number of questions. When you say the first question, he asked the question about protecting the status quo and what protected means, and then also asked about the ability to use seed water rights. But the status quo point that Mr. Donovan made, is that the first question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and Ryan, thanks for the question. Maybe I can group these together and answer them. And I hope that Linda and Kaylee don't mind, or members of the group, but I feel a little qualified to answer this question because the state engineer's office and division engineer's office has been involved in this so closely. But the importance of the status quo is not lost on us. And as we saw this develop, I think you see through the legislation that status quo is protected. This is water that cannot impact those existing, and it's important, existing exchanges occurring on the river, or, you know, for that matter, maybe substitute water supply plans that operate in the reach or something to that effect. So I think you see in the law that we reviewed that protection is there, but certainly through terms and conditions. And the reason I point to the law is I think it's a good contrast that we considered this concept so much without the legislation. And I think, Ryan, we found that it would be very difficult to ensure the status quo. The terms and conditions would be pretty extensive and difficult for each and every case. So that's probably the general answer, that the status quo is protected through that. And when you ask what does protected, sorry, different use of the word protected, what does it mean when it says these water rights are protected? They are protected from future exchanges. They are protected from diversion by future substitute water supply plans and the like. And they're certainly protected from diversion for consumptive use. That, much like a reservoir delivery, but even to a greater extent to ensure that it stays in the river. And that protection comes by virtue of the statute and the way this concept was developed, because it's water that those exchanges, et cetera, did not see before. Now, as far as taking their lumps along with all the other water being delivered, certainly transit losses, yes, but subject to new exchanges, future exchanges, no. So that's the quick answer to that. And then lastly, packaging some of your comments together, the ability to use the seed water rights. Director Hawkins, I hope you don't mind that I would continue here.
Go ahead.
The ability to use the seed water rights, I think you raise a good question about when these water rights were changed and included a use called augmentation, what was meant by that at the time. And I think that's a good concern and a difficult question to answer were it not for the legislation. the legislation clearly, and I'm looking at this signed bill. I hope that's not an awkward reference for people, but on page 2 under 3792, 102 4.5 B, and we have subsections below that. And it's clear that the plan filed must use water that was decreed for augmentation only. The HCU has been quantified, and so it lists those and clearly allows these types of water to be used in the augmentation plan. So it's a good question, and it's answered in the legislation. So I hope that was helpful. I hope I didn't go on too long, but I'll leave it at that, Ryan, and see whether that answers some of your questions.
Thank you, Director Ryan. Corey, do you have anything to add there?
I think I discussed a little bit earlier, but I might add that, you know, again, I mentioned broadly that we would need adequate measuring and recording devices, and I think whether it be an exchange, existing or future, if we have adequate measuring devices, especially if that quantification point is a bypass structure. On what normally swept, it's probably less of a concern. But we quantify and we know what water, and we calculate that and assess the transit such that, you know, the in-stream flow rights aren't injured, the existing water rights aren't injured, and whatever exchange can be operated to its fullest extent. Now, you know, structures that, or future exchanges perhaps that want to come in, that want to operate at locations that aren't at an existing bypass structure, something else that's measured, we'll have to identify and evaluate those at that point, and it may require additional measuring and recording devices to quantify.
Linda or Kaylee, is there anything you want to add on that question from CWCB staff?
Not from me, thank you.
Do any of our partners, there's a lot of folks on today, want to address this question? Seeing none, let's move on to the second question about CWCB's diligence on the seed rights. Linda, Kaylee, or Jen, do you want to take this one first?
I can start off by saying that each of the entities that are providing seed water rights have done engineering, provided us with a letter report, provided the board with a report that I think the board can base its analysis on and acceptance of the seed water rights. Kaylee, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out what to add. There's a lot there. I mean, there are a lot of terms and conditions in statute, of course, that we're following. The underlying decrees, any terms and conditions that are in the underlying decrees will be honored. If anybody has any specific concerns about any of these water rights and how they'll be used, you don't have to be an opposer in water court. Just call any of us. Just let us know what the concern is. That would be great to kind of point things out. I think that would actually be really helpful to the group to point anything out that you're concerned about. Other than that, I just think all we can do is our best to follow the terms and conditions in the underlying, impose any new terms and conditions in the new water court case. But I think the board has kind of a limited capacity to try to figure out the world of terms and conditions with this project. I think that the water users on the river are best equipped to inform us of any concerns they have. Guess that's all I have.
Thanks, Kaylee and Linda. I want to provide an opportunity for the representatives of the owners of the seed water rights to respond to this question. I'll also note there was a specific question about Thornton. Representatives from Thornton, please feel free to address that as well here if you'd like to speak.
Well, I'll just go real quickly for Fort Collins. You know, we've done the analysis. The report we provided slipped my mind, but yeah, I mean, we've done this sort of fatal flaw. Can we do this analysis since the beginning? That's why it's in the application, and that's why other water rights aren't in the application or the agreement. So, and you know, I would also just take the chance to echo that I agree with the state engineer, Kevin Ryan, on his analysis of the bill, and a lot of the issues raised are addressed pretty directly with that legislation. So, thank you.
Yeah, this is Emily Hunt. I just jumped in for Thornton. Similarly, we did a similar fatal flaw analysis on our Northern Project decree, looked very carefully at what sorts of water might be available for this application. Originally, we had hopes that a lot of other water might be able to be used, but as we dug into the decree a little bit more, we ended up actually having to pull some water out that we had originally thought would be eligible because we didn't think we'd be able to honor the terms and conditions. So similar to Fort Collins, we have a report of that analysis as well. And then just to address the protection of return flows, I guess I would just use the kind of the extreme example of the return flows that Thornton has that we owe at the South Platte Cache la Poudre confluence out of our water supply and storage company decree. So those return flows right now are accruing from kind of our easternmost farms, and they're accruing to the South Platte Poudre River confluence. That water has never seen the Poudre River. And so Thornton's proposal is to deliver that water high up at the water supply and storage company headgate on the Poudre River and carry it all the way down to that confluence. And so it's new water. All of the return flow is new water in the reaches above which it's owed. So that's just how I'd respond to that return flow, protecting the return flow comment. Thanks. And I don't know, Dave might not want to jump in with more, but.
No, I think you covered it well, Emily. And along with the return flow water, it's important to remember that additional transit loss water will be added. So the stream will not see any difference. I mean, and what Eric says, I mean, these water rights, all of us are water users on the Poudre River. Many of us have been adversaries in water court. So we have kind of vetted each other's water rights, if you will, and our water users. So we're not going to let injure ourselves, and we're keeping an eye on our neighbor. So it's that's the other thing that's going on.
Yes, and just to confirm, Greeley undertook the same analysis, reviewed the terms and conditions of both change decrees for these Greeley Irrigation Company water rights, and advised CWCB staff of those terms and conditions, and confirmed that we could operate the seed rights in this plan subject to those terms and conditions.
I'll add one thing about the public information that's available on our November board meetings. There were 4 memos in November of 2020, and attached to those memos is a whole lot of information. So each of the seed water rights are separate memos, and the seed water engineering reports from the municipalities are attached to those. The draft water court application is attached to the main memo. There's hundreds of pages, and they are available on our website. And if you download it, they're all bookmarked. You can read the exhibits, and if anybody has concerns beyond those, please just let us know.
Thank you. Do any of the other representatives of the seed water rights holders want to speak, or should I move on? Looks like we're good. Linda, I'm going to look to you for helping me call on the right person to address the question about the PMR stream flows and the augmentation plan.
And I am not sure who that person would be.
I can kick it off briefly, is that we do in the program, in this project and in our other acquisition projects, we can what we call stack water rights. So the PMR releases are between 18 and 25 CFS. And our needs in that reach are up to 260 CFS. And depending on how much water is already in the river, you add another 25, you probably have room to add some more. So they won't be, so our maximum targets are actually flow rate in the river. If there's already 260 CFS in the river, we won't be protecting any of these releases. But if there's not, we'll stack them and we'll add 25, we'll maybe add another 6. You know, if we get a future release, we might add another 10 and up to that maximum goal in those segments. So that's the stacking component. I don't know if anyone from Northern wants to speak about the PMR.
Kyle Whitaker, Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. I don't think I have anything to add. I would just, I think Kaylee explained it about as clearly as it could be explained. And I think the idea, the concept behind both the PMR as well as this in-stream flow augmentation plan is to maintain the status quo and have this water be added, both the PMR and the aug plan, to the stream on in addition to the status quo.
Thank you. I want to double check that is the end of our public comment. If there's anybody else who would like to make a comment, please let me know in the chat. And seeing none, Linda, I'll hand it back to you. I know Director Trick had another question.
Right, and I'll hand it over to Director Trick.
Yeah, just give me a second. I'm just trying to gather my thoughts a little bit. I think I'm going to change my question into just more of a comment. So hearing some of the public comment today, and also I just want to respond to the comment that I heard stated that it should be on the burden of water users to vet this program. I'm not sure that I think that is the right move. I think the board does have a duty here to kick the tires adequately and know how this is going to be operated and know what the effects are going to be on the river system. And some of the responses I have heard that seem to indicate that the water court process will just take care of this in itself concern me. Also for the reason of the large cost and expense that people have to go through to participate in water court processes. And I just feel that the board should be mindful of our due diligence here that we need to make sure we have completed before we move forward with this program. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I saw in the chat, Mr. Wambacher has not one question. We are over time, so let's make this the final round for you, okay?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be short. And I think it's related to Director Trick's comment that she just made. So has there been consideration, I guess, then in having discussions about these status quo terms and conditions as part of this process? Or is the thought that all of that will be punted basically to the water court process?
Linda,
I found my mute button.
Eric, go ahead, and then Kaylee.
Okay.
Well, I can only speak for Fort Collinsville. I mean, I think Fort Collins would certainly be willing to talk through these issues with anyone. But, you know, at the same time, we're trying to respect the distinct roles of the CWCB and the water court as outlined in the legislation, as well as trying to avoid, in essence, litigating the terms and conditions twice. But I certainly think if you would like to talk to our group and help us address some of these issues on the front end, I imagine our group would be open to it. I'm certainly open to those discussions.
Kaylee?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think that's really helpful. And Bill, I appreciate your question. So, but to remind the board of what the board's role is here is to accept an interest in water and direct staff to include that interest in a water court application. So the board does not have to say, you know, these water rates are perfect and everything's a go and we're just going to put them in the river now. It's just agreeing to start the process. It looks like Kate has a response. Kate Ryan.
Go ahead, Kate.
Thank you. I just wanted to go over real quickly the outreach and work with the general water community that we've done over the last couple of years in leading up to this process. So we did go through the legislative effort where we discussed what legislation would look like to pave the way for a plan for augmentation of in-stream flow. And in the course of preparing that legislation, we have incorporated many legislative requirements that are very, very similar to terms and conditions in a decree, because we've been working with the water community to see what might have concerned them. And so we've put what looked like terms and conditions of a water court decree in the requirements of legislation ahead of time. And we have also done outreach to water users through our local project partners, including Cache la Poudre Water Users Association and Fort Collins and Greeley, who are located along the Poudre River in the project. So they've been working with water users. And we've also gone to many public events, including going to South Platte Basin Roundtable twice, the Metro Basin Roundtable. We've gone once a couple years ago and we're going to go back. So I just wanted to bring to the board's attention that we have been working with water users, not only on the Cache la Poudre, but throughout the basin and indeed the entire state of Colorado, to listen to their concerns and to address any issues that might come up even before we enter the water court process.
Thanks, Kate. Is there anybody else who wants to address that question? And if not, go ahead, Linda.
Well, I guess I will address that question. I just want to say that CWCB staff and our partners are willing to sit down with representatives of water users to work on some of these issues prior to filing a water court application. And it looks like Director Brown has a question.
Sorry, I think it's for Kate probably, and apologies if it's covered somewhere in all of our documentation, but can you remind me, when you're saying you did this outreach for the legislation, the seed water information and the engineering and the augmentation plan was not available for the public to review at that time? So I'm assuming I guess that's my question. Was it available at that time, or did it just start becoming available on November 20th, 2020, when we had our last meeting and started our 120-day review period?
The outreach, particularly with respect to legislation, would be more generally speaking. So in preparing some legislation that provides water users across the entire state with some satisfaction that any plan for augmentation, whether it was filed on the Poudre River or elsewhere, would be generally protective of water rights. And so with respect to outreach for this particular project and the seed water engineering, when we've gone to the basin roundtables, we've spoken generally about the types of water rights that would be used, but not the specific decrees and not the high-level engineering details that were filed with the water. I think Eric might, oh, I'm sorry.
You know, I can't speak for the other municipalities, but this draft agreement with a pretty high level of detail about the specific proposal to use Fort Collins seed water rights was also brought before a city council, as well as I believe our water board. So at least, you know, there was some outreach with respect to that as well, specifically on this proposal. But yeah, I think a lot of that is now before the board, and so if you have any questions, please let us know.
Yes, thanks. So I guess just to make sure I understand this correctly, the information that we're reviewing for the seed water and for the augmentation plan became available to the public at our last board meeting, correct? There was no outreach to this specific augmentation plan that occurred prior to that. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that's correct with respect to the outreach that I've worked with, for sure.
Thank you.
Director Brown, this is David Tossig. Although it wasn't in the context of in Thornton's 1041 proceedings, it talked a lot about using this water, this same program to enhance the river. So, I mean, folks up in that process heard all about this from Emily Hunt already. So it was in a different context, but it definitely saw the light of day.
Thanks, Mr. Tossig. I guess I'm just trying to reconcile the board's duties to approve this in 60 days versus the 120 days that we have to address this, and how much outreach we owe the public, and, you know, understand that I come from a much different basin, so this is probably much more complicated for me to understand than it is for some of you on the Front Range that are dealing with these systems on a daily basis. But, you know, I'm hearing from members of the public that they would like some more time with this, and I'm trying to deliberate if that is something that we need to be honoring. You know, I see the letter that was received at the end of the year, and it doesn't appear as though their concerns have been completely addressed. Does anyone have any concern with the 60-day versus 120-day board review process? The 60 days would be, you know, the decision, and I don't want to get into actionable items from the board, but I'm just wondering from our partners, is there something that maybe we're not understanding or seeing between looking at this for action within 60 days versus 120 days, which would be, I believe, the March meeting?
Should we give staff an opportunity to maybe address that first and then hear from our partners whether that's workable?
Sure, thanks, Director Brody.
I would just like to, this is Linda, I would just like to clarify that the 120 days in the statute is providing the greatest amount of time that the board has to review and accept a proposal of an acquisition of water rights. And the board's rules provide that if no parties request a hearing within 20 days of the first board meeting of the process, that the board can take action at the next regularly scheduled board meeting. And so we, in bringing it to the board at the January meeting, we were we are following the board's procedures that are set forth in its rules. So I just wanted to put that out there as just the basis for why we are on this schedule.
Thank you for that clarification. I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, Director Brown, is whether there's harm or there are any concerns with allowing some additional time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my question, I guess. Additionally, if the extra time serves the public well, I don't want to take extra time just to take extra time, but I just want to be diligent as we go through this process. Here we are 20 minutes past our workshop. I mean, clearly the board asked questions for a number of more hours, and maybe we'll have that time, you know, on Monday or when we see this again. So I don't want to take time just to take time's sake. So I guess I look to the partners on the stretch of river and the folks, the other board members here, if that's something that seems to be a good idea or just not necessary.
Eric, did you have your hand up?
No, I was grabbing a cup of coffee next to me. I apologize.
Are there others who want to speak to Director Brown's question? Dan?
I guess from the water user standpoint, I don't see much harm in a little delay for this purpose. My gut tells me we're going to be getting into the problem that I think we all recognize. It's not a problem, but the difficulty here is going to be the administration, the actual administration. I think we're going to be starting to get into the terms and conditions and the negotiations that go on in a water court context with the absence of all of the materials to do so. So I don't see much harm in this, but I think it's going to just set the stage for further discussion that we all expect will take place as we move the matter forward in water court or before water court, where it's going to take, we realize, I think all of us, we have a long way to go in terms of discussions with water users and water court processes.
Director Schwartz?
Thank you. So I appreciate the concern for additional time for deliberation by the board. What is the precedent for 120-day reviews by the board?
This is Linda. Director Schwartz, the statute governing water acquisitions provides that the board has up to 120 days to review a proposal. And in some cases in the past, that's been extended. In other cases, the board has done it within the 2-board meeting process. So it's been all over the place in terms of how much time was needed.
So again, recognizing that, sorry, Director Dutton.
Oh, sorry, Director Brody, to cut you off there with my interclick. I guess I just wanted to kind of share where I'm at in summary with all of this, and I just want to emphasize. I know it's been emphasized, but I want to jump on this train to emphasize how much of a good idea I think this is, and I think it will lead to meaningful improvements for the Poudre and have all kinds of wonderful benefits, and that's been made very clear. And I also can't thank the partners enough for their time and their financial contributions. You know, reading the Memorandum of Understanding, it's very clear that there's been a lot of hours, but also cash invested in this, and it's a big deal. And so I just appreciate that so much. I also appreciate the fact that this is totally new and that you guys have been working on this for years, and putting all this time into giving us hundreds of pages of documents to review. And so I think it's been a big lift to get everybody up to speed. And I'm feeling that while it's all completely thorough and incredibly professionally prepared, it's obvious that future editions of Seedwater or programs of this nature in different basins will use this as a model. And so I don't see any harm in us really, taking all the time that we have, taking the 120 days to make sure that we truly understand the ins and outs. Someone said, kick the tires. I love that analogy of really making sure that we as a board understand all the nuances of this so that we're positive, not just for ourselves, but that we give the credit due to the partners, and that we're also setting future boards up for success, since this really will be the model going forward.
So one logistical question, I haven't studied the calendar closely enough to know if our next scheduled meeting is within the 120 days.
Jessica, it is, because we're earlier, a bit earlier in March, but we're just hitting it, just so this group is aware. And I think as we think about this delay and pushback in timing, I think it's important to reflect on what exactly is needed to know in those next 60 days. So I think if we're just delaying it to delay taking action for 60 additional days, what exactly is additional detail is needed to know besides time?
Director Trick?
Yeah, I think I can offer a thought on that question. So, before we began this workshop, we received notice that there were no public comments on this plan. We did get public comments during this workshop. I want to make sure that there has been an adequate public outreach process done here. And along the lines of what Director Brown said, if people have only seen the details and memos of this plan since our November meeting, and that was the first time it became available for review for the actual details of this plan, then I'm not sure that we have done our diligence in doing public outreach. And we should make sure that if there are other public comments, aside from ones that were made today, that people have the opportunity to be heard and to have those comments meaningfully addressed with answers.
Director Brown?
Thanks. I really appreciate where Becky's going with this, and I also am weighing it against the staff recommendation and understanding that we have specific duties as board members to do with this program. But going back and forth between the staff recommendations and the legislation, I'm just like, what would be helpful to me goes back to Heather's point of, how do we, and I think originally Director Brody's point of how do we do this going forward? So, are we setting up a system with this particular application that we're going to have to follow moving forward with other applications in other basins? What kind of checklist do we need for ourselves so we understand what type of process we're entering into? And I can appreciate, again, that this isn't all for the board to, say 100% we understand and play the role of water court. But there is a duty, I think, to try to make sure that we're not creating expensive water court processes for water users as well. So I guess from staff, I would like to hear from Becky, whoever wants to address it, should there be some rules around how we do this in the future, and do we need to do those before we do this? And then we have the separate outreach thing that Curran has mentioned. So I think I'm on those two different playing fields of what needs to happen with this right now. I'm sorry, that wasn't very eloquent.
Linda, can you chime in on this one? Sorry.
Sure. As far as the idea of how we approach this proposed plan for augmentation, in this case, whether we will have to do it the same way in other basins, this is our first one, and we believe that we're following the statute. Our intent is to follow the statute and the board's rules regarding acquisitions. And as we go along in this process, we may learn ways to do it better the next time in another basin. So I don't think that the way we proceed here at the administrative level ties us to doing everything exactly the same in another basin. And now I can't remember the second part of your comment, Director Brown, I apologize. Oh, that was about the outreach. And I don't have anything to add on that. I think that we are willing to engage with the people that we've heard from today and try to address their concerns.
Director Yan and then Director Schwartz.
All right, thanks, Director Brody. Appreciate it. I don't mind stretching it out because it is new, but to be honest, being part of the basin down here and being part of the roundtable and my time on the board here, this is probably one of the most outreached in-stream flows that I've seen the CWCB go through. So, and it's involving a lot of water users. And a lot of times with in-stream flows, we have, like the staff has said, if we don't get a comment, it's not unusual to act on it after 60 days. So, but I understand this is new, so I'm okay if we want to hold on as long as we know what we're asking for in the future and what kind of outreach we want, or what kind of additional outreach we want done. But if there is no hearing requested, we don't usually go that 120 days. And in the letter that we just got, which we probably should have got, you know, with our board packet, but the letter that we just got, it didn't ask for a hearing. So they just wanted to be part of this. And then the other thing that gives me a lot of comfort is that we heard from Thornton and from Fort Collins and from Greeley that they've reviewed all their water rights and they would like to donate even more, but they don't fit. And so, and they also came together with the legislation to make it purposeful to limit the kind of water that you can use for this. So all of those things lumped together it's a pretty convincing argument, you know, that this is a pretty good deal. And then I hear, you know, when I've heard Emily talk about bringing the water, they could just dump the water, you know, right at the confluence of the Platte, some of their water, but they're willing to accept all the transit losses all the way through the reach for the benefit of some in-stream flow along there. So, you know, that to me, that's kind of a big deal as well. So I guess when I wrap my whole head around all this and listen to the state engineer and the division engineer and all of this, I mean, it's a great plan. And but like I said, if we want more comfort because it's new, I don't have opposition to waiting another 60 days. If that doesn't, you know, I wouldn't think, this is still a long process, so I wouldn't think that it would be a hardship on any of the people involved in this, because they're going to have to work through it anyway. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Director Schwartz, and then I think we need to try to wrap this up because we are over time.
Just quickly in building on, and thank you, Director Brody, and building on Director Yan's comments, that to what extent, I guess it's a question, has the entire record been part of our information, our deliberation, even if it wasn't specific CWCB outreach, 1041 processes, roundtables, community, the community outreach. I think there's a body of outreach that I think we can have some reliance on because it has been reviewed locally and assessed at other levels. So to the extent that our CWCB is maybe discrete in terms of our outreach, but I'm willing to accept and rely on the body of outreach over time. So just saying that I think it has been vetted locally, and to the extent that we can rely on that, I don't feel strongly about extending our review.
Thank you, Director Schwartz. So just as a reminder, we are not taking any action today. This is on the agenda for next week. And certainly if board members would like, they have the opportunity to move to continue it to the next meeting if you think that's warranted and appropriate. And I hope over the weekend, staff and the proponents will take some time to consider the questions and comments that were made. And we will pick this back up next week. Linda and Kayla, was there anything else you wanted to add today?
No, thank you, Director Brody.
Well, again, thank you all for your time here today, and more importantly, for all the time and energy and incredible work and collaboration you've put into this effort so far. And we'll hear more next week.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.